I turned myself into a sleep aid, Morty. I'm Sleepy Rick. In this 2.5-hour journey, Rick's experimental sleep machine creates a recursive dreamscape where each story flows into the next, forming the perfect backdrop for your descent into unconsciousness. We've carefully crafted each segment to become progressively more soothing, with Rick occasionally breaking the fourth wall to remind you that you're safe and it's okay to drift off. The circular narrative structure means you can start listening at any point and still experience the full calming effect. It's sleep science meets interdimensional adventure. What if I told you Rick's experimental sleep machine was never supposed to create nested dreams? That's where our journey begins tonight. We find ourselves in the familiar setting of Rick's garage, cluttered with half-finished inventions and mysterious gadgets that defy the laws of physics as we know them. Rick is hunched over his workbench, putting the finishing touches on his latest creation, a device that resembles a mix between a vintage radio and a futuristic EEG machine. "Morty, this is going to change your life," Rick announces, not bothering to look up from his work. "You've been complaining about insomnia for weeks now, and frankly, your constant tiredness is becoming a liability during our adventures." Morty stands nervously nearby, rubbing his arm as he eyes the contraption with justified suspicion. "I don't know, Rick. The last time you tried to help me sleep, I ended up trapped in the dreamscape of a giant space squid for what felt like 3 years." "That was different, Morty," Rick dismisses with a wave of his hand. "This machine precisely calibrates your brain waves to induce perfectly balanced REM sleep cycles. No interdimensional travel, no consciousness transfer, just good old-fashioned neurological manipulation. Science at its most boring and safe." The device hums to life as Rick flips a series of switches. A holographic display materializes above the machine, showing colorful wave patterns that pulse and shift. Rick begins explaining how the human brain transitions through different sleep stages throughout the night. "See, Morty, most sleep aids just knock you unconscious, but they don't actually give you quality sleep. The brain needs to cycle naturally through stages, from light sleep to deep sleep to REM, and back again. This baby will monitor your brain activity and make micro-adjustments to keep you in the optimal sleep pattern all night." As Rick continues his explanation, strange readings begin to appear on the monitor. Numbers fluctuate wildly for a moment, before settling back into normal ranges. Morty points at the screen with concern. Rick, is it supposed to do that?" Rick glances at the readings, a flash of concern crossing his face before he quickly masks it with his typical overconfidence. "Just normal calibration fluctuations, Morty. The machine is learning your baseline neurological patterns. Nothing to worry about. But something is definitely off." Inside the transparent casing of the device, we can see components glowing with an unusual purple hue, a stark contrast to the green energy that typically powers Rick's technology. Rick either doesn't notice this anomaly or chooses to ignore it as he continues preparing the machine. "All right, lie down on the cot," Rick instructs, grabbing a set of electrodes connected to thin wires. "These will monitor your brain activity while simultaneously delivering precise electromagnetic pulses to guide your sleep cycles." Morty reluctantly reclines on the small cot Rick has set up beside the workbench. The ceiling of the garage seems to shimmer slightly as he looks up, but he blinks, and it appears normal again. Rick begins attaching electrodes to Morty's temples with surprising gentleness. The average person spends about 2 hours dreaming every night, but most people don't remember more than a fraction of those dreams, Rick explains, his voice taking on an unusually soothing quality. "During REM sleep, your brain processes emotions and consolidates memories. It's like a mental defragmentation program running in the background." The machine begins to hum with an increasingly resonant frequency that seems to vibrate through the room. Rick pauses mid-attachment, a look of concern flashing across his face as he glances at the device. For just a moment, his confident demeanor falters. That's odd," he mutters, adjusting some dials. The harmonic resonance is amplifying faster than expected. "Should we stop?" Morty asks, already sounding drowsy despite the process having barely begun. No, it's fine," Rick insists, though his furrowed brow suggests otherwise. Just need to make a few adjustments to the calibration matrix. As Rick turns his attention to the control panel, Morty's eyelids grow heavy. The purple glow from inside the machine intensifies, casting eerie shadows across the garage. Rick is too focused on the readings to notice a small but significant detail, a hairline crack forming along the side of the device. Not a normal fracture, but something that seems to bend space itself. A miniature interdimensional fissure taking shape within the machine's casing. Your brain is already transitioning into the first stage of sleep, Rick notes, his voice now deliberately calm and measured. You're experiencing hypnagogia, that floating sensation as consciousness begins to drift. Just go with it, Morty. Let the machine guide you down. The room itself seems to respond to Rick's words, the edges of objects becoming slightly blurred, light sources developing subtle halos. The crack in the machine grows incrementally wider, emitting a whisper-quiet sound like distant wind. Rick makes final adjustments to the settings, still unaware of the dimensional anomaly forming inches from his hands. Morty's breathing has become deep and regular, his expression peaceful for the first time in weeks. The machine's humming intensifies, resonating at a frequency that seems to make reality itself vibrate in sympathy. It's only when the entire room begins to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, that Rick finally realizes something has gone catastrophically wrong. Wait, this isn't right, Rick says, suddenly alert. He rapidly types commands into the control panel, but the machine seems to be operating according to its own programming now. Morty, I need to wake you up. The machine is creating some kind of recursive neural feedback loop. But it's too late. As Rick reaches to disconnect the electrodes from Morty's temples, the interdimensional crack suddenly expands, enveloping the machine in a purple glow that quickly spreads throughout the garage. The light pulses in perfect rhythm with Morty's breathing. Oh, shh! Rick's curse is cut short as the purple energy washes over him too. He struggles against it for a moment before his expression shifts from panic to scientific curiosity. Fascinating. It's not just affecting your brain patterns, Morty. It's creating a nested dream architecture. Dreams within dreams. Rick's voice becomes slower, his movements more languid as the energy affects him too. The recursion pattern. It's creating a perfect loop, taking you through progressively deeper dream states. His scientific mind can't help but analyze the phenomenon, even as he's being pulled into it. It's actually mimicking natural sleep cycles, cycling through stages just like the human brain does throughout the night. The purple light intensifies once more, and Rick makes one last attempt to reach the machine before his consciousness is fully subsumed. His fingers brush against the control panel but fall, short of making any adjustments. Both Rick and Morty are now caught in the machine's influence, their minds linked in a shared dreamscape that will take them deeper and deeper with each passing moment. That strange purple light was just the beginning of their journey into a nested dreamscape, with the first stop being a planet where physics and consciousness merge in impossible ways. While most planets have atmospheres made of gases, this world has an atmosphere composed of thoughts themselves, creating an environment where what you think becomes what you hear. And the whispers surrounding them might hold the key to escaping this recursive dream trap. As the purple energy disperses around them, Rick and Morty find themselves standing in a misty landscape unlike anything they've encountered before. The fog isn't made of water droplets, but seems to shimmer with a strange luminescence that responds to their presence. With each step they take, the mist parts and swirls, almost as if it's aware of them. "What is this place?" Morty whispers, his voice carrying differently than normal, seeming to echo in impossible ways. "I'm not entirely sure, Morty," Rick responds, his voice noticeably softer than usual. "But based on these readings, we're on what I'd call a psycho-responsive planet. The atmosphere here isn't just nitrogen and oxygen, it's a complex matrix of psychically reactive particles." As Rick speaks, his voice gradually becomes more soothing, as if the planet itself is modulating his typical gruff tone into something more melodic. The effect is subtle but unmistakable. Morty turns his head suddenly, hearing what sounds like his name being called from somewhere in the distance. "Did you hear that?" Rick nods slowly, scanning their surroundings. "This place, it's picking up on our thoughts. The atmosphere here is similar to what we've seen at the Citadel, but way more advanced. Instead of just amplifying sound, it's transforming our neural patterns into audible wavelengths. They continue walking through the strange landscape where colors seem to shift subtly with each passing moment. What was once a vibrant purple slowly fades to a muted blue, then a soft lavender. The whispers grow more numerous as they venture deeper into this mysterious world. It's like the whole planet is one giant interconnected nervous system, Rick explains, his voice becoming increasingly hypnotic. Every organism here, from what looks like plants to those floating light creatures, they're all linked telepathically. What one thinks, they all share. And somehow, we've been pulled into their network. Morty stops suddenly, his eyes widening. I can hear myself? But it's things I never said out loud. He turns to Rick with a confused expression. I just heard myself thinking about that time with the space snakes, but it wasn't exactly my memory. It was different somehow. Rick's interest is piqued, but he doesn't appear surprised. He examines a small device on his wrist, noting readings that only he can interpret. Interesting. The foggy atmosphere here distorts sound in ways that create this eerie ambiance. It's similar to what happens during sleep onset in the human brain, when we process auditory information differently and sometimes hear sounds that aren't actually there. As they continue their journey, Morty begins to notice patterns in the whispers, certain phrases or words that repeat with greater frequency. There's something about connections and stories. I can almost understand it, but then it slips away. The landscape around them subtly transforms with each step. What initially appeared to be rocky terrain now resembles something more organic, almost like they're walking through the folds of a giant brain. Small inconsistencies begin to appear. A rock that wasn't there a moment ago, a path that seems to circle back on itself despite moving forward. Rick notices these anomalies but says nothing to Morty. Instead, he observes with scientific curiosity as the whispers grow more coordinated, less random. His eyes narrow slightly as he recognizes what's happening, but he chooses to let the experience unfold. The whispers are getting louder over here, Morty says, drawn toward what appears to be a grove of crystalline structures that pulse with inner light. As they approach, the whispers coalesce into a more coherent pattern, though the meaning remains elusive. There's something familiar about this, Rick muses, his voice now barely above a whisper himself. The planet's telepathic field isn't just picking up our surface thoughts, it's connecting to deeper mental patterns. Dreams within dreams create unique neural signatures, and this place is amplifying them. When they reach the crystal grove, each formation appears to respond to their presence, glowing more intensely and producing harmonic tones that somehow complement the whispers. Morty reaches out hesitantly to touch one of the crystals. Be careful, Rick cautions, but not with his usual alarm. There's a knowing quality to his warning, as if he's more curious than concerned about what might happen. When Morty's fingers brush against the crystal surface, the whispers suddenly align into a clear message. The threads connect all dreams. Follow them to find your way. Rick's eyes widen slightly. Morty, I think I understand what this place is. It's not just any planet. It's a nexus point in the dream universe. These whispers we're hearing, they're connections between different dreamscapes, different stories playing out across the multiverse of unconsciousness. The crystal begins to pulse in rhythm with Morty's heartbeat, and the whispers become a gentle chorus, repeating variations of the same message about connections and paths and dreams within dreams. So what do we do? Morty asks, his voice barely audible as the environment around them seems to absorb sound selectively. Rick studies the patterns of light flowing through the crystal formation. We follow the whispers. They're like threads in a cosmic tapestry, connecting different parts of the dream universe. If we can trace one back to its source, we might find a way to understand this recursive dream trap we're in. As they make their decision to follow the most resonant whisper, the misty landscape around them begins to shift more dramatically. Colors blend and blur at the edges of their vision, and the solid ground beneath their feet seems less substantial with each step. The whispers are leading us somewhere, Rick says, his voice now perfectly calibrated to be heard clearly while still maintaining a soothing quality. Each one is like a story waiting to be uncovered. As we move deeper into this dream state, we'll encounter more of these threads, these connections between different parts of the dream universe. They follow a particularly compelling whisper down a path that seems to form itself before them, the mist parting to reveal the way forward. The crystal formations grow more elaborate, and the whispers more harmonious as they venture deeper into this strange realm. The harmonious whispers abruptly crystallize into a single, resonant tone as Rick and Morty step through what feels like an invisible threshold. The mist clears completely, revealing not another natural formation but something far more profound, an impossibly vast structure that materializes before them, stretching beyond what the eye can comprehend in every direction. This isn't just any library, it's a repository of consciousness itself, where the memories of every Rick and Morty throughout the multiverse have been cataloged and preserved. "Holy crap, Rick," Morty whispers, his voice automatically hushing in response to the reverent atmosphere. "What is this place?" "This," Rick says, his own voice uncharacteristically soft, "is what happens when consciousness becomes tangible, Morty. A library where memories aren't stored in minds but cataloged like books." As they venture deeper into the cavernous space, the architecture seems to respond to their presence. Shelves stretch upward beyond sight, containing not regular books but softly glowing vessels that pulse with gentle light. The air feels charged with potential, as if the very atmosphere is saturated with experiences waiting to be accessed. A figure approaches them from between two towering shelves, moving with a graceful, deliberate pace. It appears to be bird person, but different. His features have taken on owl-like qualities, with feathered tufts resembling ears and eyes that seem to contain galaxies within them. "Welcome to the collective unconscious," the owl-like bird person intones, his voice retaining that familiar measured cadence but with an added resonance that seems to echo from multiple points in space simultaneously. Here, all memories of all Ricks and Mortys across every timeline are preserved and accessible. "Bird person?" Morty asks hesitantly. "Is that really you?" "I am merely a manifestation of your shared connection to bird person," the librarian explains. "In this place, I represent the bridge between individual consciousness and collective memory." The librarian guides them through the initial chambers, explaining how the library functions. Each vessel contains not merely a record of events, but the complete emotional and sensory experience of the memory itself. To open one is to live it again, exactly as it was experienced originally. Rick's attention drifts to a section off to their left, where several shelves emit a subtle blue glow that seems different from the ambient light of the rest of the library. Without saying anything to Morty or the librarian, he changes direction and approaches the glowing section, drawn to it as if by some unseen force. Meanwhile, Morty curiously reaches for one of the memory vessels on a nearby shelf. The moment his fingers make contact, the vessel's glow intensifies, and suddenly he's no longer standing in the library but experiencing something entirely different. He can feel sand beneath his feet, smell the distinctive odor of a strange alien world, and most disorienting of all, he can feel the emotional state of a Morty he's never met. A profound mixture of wonder and relief at having survived an adventure gone terribly wrong. "Whoa!" Morty gasps as he pulls his hand away, snapping back to the library. I was completely there. I felt everything that other Morty felt." "Yes," the bird person librarian nods. "That is the nature of true memory. Not just the facts of what happened, but the complete subjective experience." Morty turns to share his amazement with Rick, only to find that his grandfather has wandered deeper into the blue glowing section. As Morty moves to follow, he notices something strange about the library itself. The corridor he just passed through seems shorter than it was moments before, and a bookshelf that he could have sworn was to his left is now somehow behind him. The architecture responds to intention rather than physical laws, the librarian explains, noticing Morty's confusion. Passages extend or contract based on the unconscious desires of those within. It makes navigation challenging for newcomers. Morty hurries to catch up with Rick, who has stopped before a particular shelf. Rick stands motionless, staring at a single vessel labeled Diane. His hand hovers near it, trembling slightly, an unusual display of vulnerability from someone normally so decisive and cavalier. "Rick?" Morty asks quietly. "Who's Diane?" Rick doesn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the glowing vessel. When he finally speaks, his voice has a quality Morty rarely hears, a softness tinged with something like reverence, or perhaps regret. "Some memories are better left in their vessels, Morty," Rick says, though his hand still hovers near the container. "Some things you can never unsee or unfeel once you've experienced them again." The bird-person librarian approaches silently. "The most powerful memories are often those we most fear to revisit," he observes. "Yet they define us more than any others." Rick's fingers finally make contact with the vessel, and as he does, something extraordinary happens. The entire library begins to pulse with a gentle rhythm, a soft throbbing of light that perfectly matches the cadence of a human heartbeat in deep sleep. The sound is subtle but unmistakable, a rhythmic whooshing that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Morty watches in fascination as Rick experiences whatever memory is contained within the vessel labeled Diane. Rick's expressions shift rapidly. Tenderness, joy, sorrow, and something that might be fear all flash across his face in quick succession. "What's happening to the library?" Morty asks the librarian, referring to the pulsing rhythm. "The most significant memories have resonance beyond their individual vessels," the owl-like bird person explains. "They create harmonic patterns that affect the entire collection. Your grandfather's memory is particularly powerful." As Rick's experience concludes, he withdraws his hands slowly from the vessel, his eyes remaining closed for several seconds afterward. When he finally opens them, there's a clarity there that wasn't present before. "Memory isn't just about preserving the past, Morty," Rick says quietly. "Sometimes it's about understanding it differently so you can move forward." As they continue through the library, Morty begins to recognize certain vessels that seem to contain experiences familiar from their adventures. One glows with the green light of portal fluid. Another pulses with the distinctive energy signature of the Citadel. There are vessels that seem to contain memories of events Morty recognizes from episodes in their lives, but from slightly different perspectives, as if they're dreams rather than perfect recordings. "Why do some of these memories seem different?" Morty asks. "Memory is never perfect," the librarian explains. "What you're seeing are memories that have been partially processed during sleep cycles, transformed into something between experience and dream. These half-remembered versions often contain deeper emotional truths than perfect recordings." Curious, Morty approaches a shelf containing smaller vessels organized in a pattern that reminds him of stars in a constellation. At the center is one labeled simply "The Beginning." Something about it calls to him, and almost without thinking, he reaches out to touch it. The moment his fingers make contact, the vessel's light intensifies dramatically. Instead of experiencing a single memory, Morty feels a cascade of connections forming. Threads linking countless experiences across the multiverse, all originating from this single point of inception. "Rick," Morty calls out, unsure whether to be afraid or amazed. "Something's happening." The light from the vessel expands outward, enveloping both of them. The structure of the library itself begins to dissolve around them, the shelves fragmenting not into dust, but into thousands of tiny luminescent butterfly-like entities. Each one contains a fragment of memory, a single moment preserved in gossamer wings that beat in perfect unison. The luminescent memory butterflies swirl around Rick and Morty, but as they dance through the air, Rick's expression suddenly shifts. His eyes narrow, his head tilts slightly, and then something impossible happens. He turns away from Morty and looks directly at you, not past you or through you, but at you specifically, with a gaze that somehow pierces the veil between your reality and his. "Morty, we're not alone," Rick whispers, his voice taking on an unusually gentle tone. "There's someone else here, someone listening." Morty spins around, scanning the dissolving library. "What? Who? Another Rick? Is evil Morty back?" No, nothing like that." Rick waves his hand dismissively, his eyes never leaving yours. "This is different. The dream device has created some kind of consciousness bridge. Someone from outside our reality is experiencing this dream with us." The butterflies begin to coalesce around Rick and Morty, their light shifting from the previous cool blues to warmer, more comforting ambers and soft purples. As they gather, the fragmented library transforms. Bookshelves melt away, the endless corridors contract, and the space around them reshapes into something entirely new. A sanctuary of sorts. Interesting, Rick muses, his voice dropping to that special register he rarely uses, the one without sarcasm, without edge. The dream environment is responding to your presence. It's creating a space where all three of us can exist together. The sanctuary materializes fully now. It's a circular room with soft, curved walls that seem to breathe gently. A central fire pit glows with flames that produce no smoke, only a pleasant warmth that spreads throughout the space. Overhead, the ceiling has disappeared, replaced by a star field so vast and clear it feels like you could reach up and touch the cosmos itself. The dream device must be creating a parasocial connection, Rick explains to Morty, while still maintaining that strange eye contact with you. It's actually pretty fascinating from a neurological perspective. The human brain responds differently to familiar voices during the transition to sleep, creates a sense of security which helps with relaxation. Rick gestures toward a collection of comfortable-looking seating arrangements that have formed around the fire pit. Cushions, low couches, and nest-like chairs that seem perfectly designed for comfort. Make yourself comfortable, he says, and it's clear he's speaking to you now, not Morty. The bridge works both ways. I can sense you're getting drowsy. That's good. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. Morty's brow furrows. Rick, who are you talking to? There's nobody there. They're there, Morty, just not in the same dimensional plane we typically occupy. Rick's voice becomes softer, more measured, with longer pauses between sentences. This is what happens when the quantum boundaries of consciousness begin to overlap. It's like tuning into a frequency that's usually just beyond our perception. The butterflies have settled now, some perching on the walls, others hovering near the ceiling, creating a gentle, pulsing glow that perfectly complements the firelight. The ambient sounds have faded away, until all that remains is the soft crackle of the flames and Rick's voice. You know, whoever you are, Rick continues, settling into one of the chairs and motioning for Morty to do the same. There's a theory about multiverse consciousness that only works in dreams. Regular science can't explain it because waking minds are too rigid, too bound by rules. Morty sits, still looking confused but clearly affected by the tranquil environment. His usual anxiety seems to melt away as he sinks into the cushions. In the space between wakefulness and deep sleep, Rick continues, his cadence becoming almost hypnotic. Consciousness becomes permeable, flexible. The barriers between dimensions thin out until sometimes they disappear altogether. The stars overhead begin to move, not randomly, but in deliberate patterns, forming constellations that tell stories without words. Rick watches them for a moment, then turns his attention back to you. That's what's happening right now. Your consciousness and our story are intertwining, creating something new, something that exists only in this moment. Rick's hand moves in a gentle wave, and the light in the sanctuary dims just slightly, creating the perfect environment for drifting deeper towards sleep. The fascinating thing about this connection, Rick says, his voice now barely above a whisper, is that it works on the principle of neural resonance. When you hear a voice you've come to know, especially during that twilight state between wakefulness and sleep, your brain produces a sense of safety. It's evolutionary, really. Familiar voices meant protection when our ancestors slept vulnerable in the wild. Morty's eyelids have grown heavy, and he yawns, curling up in his seat. Is this another of your lectures, Rick? He mumbles, but there's no irritation in his voice, only comfortable drowsiness. Not a lecture, Morty. A connection. Rick's focus remains on you. I can sense when you're drifting. The dream responds to your state of consciousness. Notice how the stars pulse in rhythm with your breathing? How the light adjusts to match your comfort level? Indeed, the entire sanctuary seems to breathe with you, expanding and contracting in perfect harmony with your respiratory rhythm. The temperature remains ideal, not too warm, not too cool. Even the cushions beneath you seem to adjust their firmness to match your preference. This is the safest place in the multiverse right now, Rick continues, his voice taking on an almost protective quality. Nothing can disturb you here. just like I watch over Morty on our adventures, making sure he gets home safe despite all my complaints. I'm watching over this space, too. Morty has fallen asleep now, his chest rising and falling peacefully. Rick glances at him with a rare expression of unguarded affection before returning his attention to you. There's something unique about dream states like this, he explains, his voice getting progressively more soothing. The conscious mind steps back, and the barriers between realities become permeable. That's why I can sense you out there, listening. That's why this connection works. The sanctuary continues its gentle pulse, the stars overhead forming new patterns, telling stories without the need for words. The butterflies glow with a soft, rhythmic light that matches the cadence of Rick's voice. I don't do this sort of thing often, Rick admits, his typical gruffness momentarily absent. Breaking the fourth wall, acknowledging someone beyond our reality. But dreams have different rules, and right now, those rules are allowing something special. As Rick speaks, a new feature appears in the sanctuary, a door that wasn't there before. It materializes slowly in one of the curved walls, its frame glowing with a soft blue light. Rick notices it and raises an eyebrow. Looks like our journey's not over yet, he observes, his voice still maintaining that calming cadence. There's more to explore in this dream world we've created together. Deeper levels waiting beyond that door. Beyond the glowing door lies something neither Rick nor Morty expected. Not the harsh chaos of interdimensional travel, but a limitless sea where dimensions themselves have melted into liquid form, creating perhaps the most tranquil environment in any reality. Whoa, Morty whispers, his voice barely audible as they step through the doorway and find themselves gently floating on what appears to be an endless ocean stretching in all directions. But this isn't water. It's something far more extraordinary. This is the dimensional ocean, Morty, Rick explains, his voice noticeably different now. Deeper, more resonant, with longer pauses between phrases. It's where all dimensions bleed together, creating something entirely new. They drift effortlessly on the surface, which undulates beneath them like a living thing. The liquid dimensions ripple with hues of blue and purple, creating patterns that seem to respond to their very thoughts. Beneath the surface, they can see glimpses of infinite peaceful realities. A garden where crystalline trees grow upside down, a meadow where gravity works sideways, a mountain range where time flows backward. Most people think the space between dimensions is just empty void, Rick continues, his voice becoming almost hypnotic in its rhythm. But that's just how we perceive it. When we're rushing through, these colors around us, the blues and purples, they actually promote rest and tranquility in the human brain. Morty notices that as Rick mentions this fact, the ocean responds by intensifying those exact colors, creating a soothing palette that seems to wrap around them like a blanket. It's not a coincidence that this feels so calming, Rick says, trailing his fingers through the dimensional liquid. The gentle lapping of these waves matches the exact frequency of delta waves in the human brain during deep sleep stages. The dimensional ocean moves with a perfect rhythm, rising and falling in a pattern that seems to synchronize with their breathing. With each wave, Morty feels himself relaxing further, his eyelids growing heavier. Look up, Rick suggests softly. Morty tilts his head back and gasps. The stars above aren't fixed points of light as they should be. They're slowly shifting, rearranging themselves into new constellations that seem to tell stories. One formation looks briefly like a council chamber where multiple Ricks are gathered, then shifts to show a spaceship soaring through a nebula, then transforms again into what appears to be a family having dinner. The stars here are actually windows into other timelines, Rick explains. Stories from across the multiverse, playing out in real time. They're constantly changing, because reality itself is fluid here. Morty notices something else unusual. Their voices don't echo or fade away as they should in an open space. Instead, their words seem to melt into the dimensional ocean, becoming part of its essence. Our thoughts and words are becoming part of this place, Rick says, seeming to read Morty's mind. That's why everything feels in perfect harmony. The ocean absorbs and redistributes, energy in its most peaceful form. As they continue to drift, Morty realizes that the dimensional liquid isn't just beneath them. It's starting to become part of the atmosphere around them too. Tiny droplets float upward, catching light and refracting it in mesmerizing patterns. Is this still part of the dream device malfunction? Morty asks, his voice now matching Rick's slower cadence. Rick smiles. Yes and no. The device created the path, but this place has always existed. It's just that most beings never experience it because they're too focused on getting from one dimension to another. They miss all of this. Rick points toward the horizon, where a distant formation is visible, what appears to be an island rising from the dimensional sea. Unlike the fluid nature of everything else around them, the island seems more solid, more defined, yet somehow dreamlike in its quality. See that? That's something special, Rick says. An island made entirely of dreams. I believe it might be the center of our dream recursion, the core that's holding all these levels together. The island seems to shimmer and pulse with a gentle light, as if beckoning them closer. As they drift toward it, Morty notices something extraordinary happening where the dimensional ocean meets the sky. The boundaries between them are starting to blur and dissolve. The divisions between elements aren't fixed here, Rick explains, his voice now so calming that it seems to be part of the environment itself. Just like in the deepest stages of sleep, when the boundaries between different dream segments begin to dissolve. The dimensional liquid has now formed itself into a gentle current, carrying them steadily toward the dream island. All around them, the blue and purple hues pulse and swirl in patterns that somehow feel familiar and comforting, like returning to a place they've always known. These colors aren't just pretty, Morty, Rick says, gesturing to the swirling blues and purples. They're actually working on your brain right now, lowering your heart rate, promoting a sense of peace. Color psychology shows that these specific wavelengths are ideal for sleep environments, creating the perfect transition state. Morty notices that the closer they get to the island, the more the ocean and sky seem to merge into one continuous realm. The stars above now appear to be both above and below them simultaneously, as if they're floating through the very fabric of the cosmos itself. Remember how interdimensional space used to feel so chaotic and unpredictable? Rick asks. This is the same space, just experienced differently, at a slower pace, with greater awareness. The gentle rocking motion of the dimensional waves creates a perfect rhythm, like a cosmic lullaby. Morty feels himself growing increasingly serene, his thoughts becoming as fluid as the environment around them. This is the most calming point in our journey, Rick whispers. The perfect middle, where everything balances. If someone were listening to our story, this would be where their consciousness might begin, to truly drift. As they approach the dream island, the distinction between the ocean and air continues to blur until they seem to be floating through a single unified medium. Not quite liquid, not quite gas, but something in between that embraces them completely. The embracing medium gradually thickens around them, and Rick notices his movements becoming unusually prolonged, each gesture trailing behind his intention by several seconds. We've reached the slumberlands, Morty, he says, his words stretching like taffy, where a single minute of real time can contain what feels like hours of experience. Morty watches in fascination as his hand moves through the air, leaving a trail of after-images that fade slowly, like a visual echo. Unlike earlier adventures, his face shows no signs of anxiety. Instead, he seems captivated by the strange physics of this new realm. This is actually what happens in your brain during certain sleep cycles, Rick explains, his voice noticeably deeper and more resonant than before. Your perception of time completely warps. He demonstrates by snapping his fingers, the sound taking several moments to reach their ears, stretching from a sharp click into a long, melodic tone. The landscape around them is unlike any dimension they've visited before. Bioluminescent creatures drift through the air, their movements so gradual they appear suspended in animation. Each organism emits a soft, pulsating glow in shades of indigo and violet, creating natural light sources throughout the otherwise dim environment. The creatures range from microscopic floating particles to enormous jellyfish-like beings that span hundreds of feet overhead, their tentacles barely moving as they create a canopy of gentle illumination. These chronodrifters live their entire lives in extreme slow motion, Rick explains, pointing to a particularly intricate specimen that resembles a crystalline snowflake. To them, we'd normally be moving too fast to even perceive, but right now, we're on their wavelength. Morty experiments with the strange physics, spinning in a slow circle and watching as colors blur and trail behind him. "It's beautiful," he says, his voice carrying a newfound appreciation that contrasts with his typical anxious demeanor. "It's like being inside a painting that's still being created." The ground beneath them isn't solid, but rather a layer of microscopic particles that respond to their footsteps by slowly shifting and reforming. Each step creates rippling patterns that spread outward for minutes before dissipating. The air itself seems to have substance, not quite liquid, not quite gas, offering just enough resistance to make each movement feel deliberate and meaningful. The slumberlands exist at the boundary between REM sleep and deep sleep, Rick continues, his scientific explanation taking on an unusually poetic quality. It's where thoughts become tangible, physical things. He reaches out and seemingly plucks something invisible from the air, which gradually materializes as a small orb of swirling energy in his palm. Here, a single emotion can become a landscape. As if responding to his words, the environment around them subtly shifts. The distant horizon, previously shrouded in mist, reveals a mountain range that seems to pulse in rhythm with deep, barely audible bass tones that permeate the entire dimension. These low-frequency sounds create a constant harmonic backdrop, their waves visibly rippling through the air like gentle currents. "Those sounds you're hearing?" Rick gestures toward the distant mountains. "They're operating at exactly 0.5 to 3 Hz, the same frequency as your brain during deep sleep stages. The physics here is literally tuned to human rest cycles." Morty watches as a school of tiny light specks swims past them, moving in perfect mathematical patterns. "They're like thoughts," he observes, showing an intuitive understanding that surprises even Rick. "Exactly, Morty. In this place, the distinction between mind and matter doesn't exist." Rick's movements become even more languid as he gestures toward a valley that's gradually becoming visible in the distance. "And down there is where we're headed. The deepest point of the dream cycle." The valley glows with a soft, pulsating light that seems to beckon them forward. As they make their way down the gentle slope, their footsteps leave trails of luminescence that linger for minutes before slowly fading away. The air thickens further, creating the sensation of moving through something more substantial than atmosphere, but lighter than water. "You know what's really wild about slow-motion dream states?" Rick's voice has slowed to match their environment, each word carefully formed and lingering in the air. "Your brain actually processes information more thoroughly here. What might take days of conscious thought can be sorted through in what feels like moments. That's why people often wake up with solutions to problems they couldn't solve while awake." Morty nods, his movement creating a cascade of afterimages. "Is that why sometimes I feel like I've been dreaming for hours when it's only been a few minutes?" Precisely. Your brain isn't constrained by normal time perception during sleep. In the slumberlands, that effect is amplified. Rick's gestures leave trails of light as he speaks, his hands painting concepts in the air that briefly materialize before dissolving back into the atmosphere. They approach what appears to be a forest of towering crystalline structures, each one humming at a slightly different frequency. The combined tones create a harmonic resonance that seems to vibrate through Morty's entire body, not unpleasantly, but like a gentle massage from the inside out. "These are thought structures," Rick explains, his voice now so deep and slow it's almost hypnotic. "Pure consciousness, given form. They exist at the boundary between sensation and understanding." As they walk among the crystal-like formations, Each one responds to their presence by shifting hue and tone. Colors flow through the structures like liquid light, blues deepening to purples, then shifting to indigos before returning to their original state. The closer we get to the center of the slumberlands, Rick continues, the less distinction there is between you and everything else. Conscious thought gives way to pure sensation. Morty reaches out to touch one of the structures, and as his fingers make contact, the entire formation lights up with images from his own mind, fragmented memories and emotions dancing through the crystalline surface. Unlike his previous adventures where such vulnerability would cause panic, Morty remains calm, even curious. "You're getting it now," Rick observes with what might be pride in his voice. "You're not fighting the dream state anymore. You're flowing with it." Indeed, Morty seems to have undergone a subtle transformation since they first entered this dream journey. The anxious, questioning boy has given way to a more centered presence, someone capable of experiencing without immediately judging or fearing. The vibrations from the crystal forest gradually synchronize with their own movements, creating a feedback loop that makes their progress feel both effortless and inevitable. With each step, the boundary between their physical forms and the environment grows less distinct, their edges softening, outlines blurring. "We're approaching the transition point," Rick says, his voice now so languid that each word seems to float independently in the air. "Beyond this is something even deeper." As they step beyond the transition point, their bodies scatter into countless fragments of light. No longer people, but impressions in a vast mindscape of flowing color. What happens to your consciousness when even the concept of self dissolves? In this realm, the abstract foundation of all thought takes physical form, moving with the same rhythm as your deepest sleep brainwaves. Rick's voice no longer comes from a specific location but seems to emanate from everywhere at once. The timbre of his speech transforms into something more musical, each word carrying emotional resonance beyond its meaning. "This is pure thought," his voice impression explains, the phrase rippling outward in waves of blue and green light. "Before language, before identity." Morty exists now as a swirling pattern of yellow and orange, his anxiety manifesting as rapid pulses that gradually slow and stabilize as he adapts to this new state of being. There's no ground beneath them, no sky above, just an infinite expanse where directions have lost all meaning. Forms emerge and dissolve in continuous flow, creating a hypnotic display that's simultaneously random yet perfectly orchestrated. What once were coherent thoughts now communicate as pure emotional impressions. A burst of warm gold represents curiosity, while expanding rings of violet convey understanding. The environment responds to these emotional signals, with the surrounding colors and patterns shifting in perfect synchronicity. Here in the abstract mindscape, traditional narrative has completely fallen away, replaced by a more primal form of experience that bypasses analytical thought entirely. Fluid, non-linear movements dominate this space, with vibrant colors swirling and blending to create an immersive sensation that works directly on your subconscious. The entire experience evokes emotional responses without requiring any structured storyline to follow. Your mind can engage with these abstract visuals on a purely instinctual level, similar to how Adult Swim's experimental animation techniques often blend philosophical themes with abstract imagery to promote relaxation and contemplation. Familiar elements from earlier dream levels reappear, but transformed into their essential symbolic forms. The whispers from the mysterious planet now manifest as pulsating silver threads that weave through the mindscape. The memory vessels from the library appear as glowing spheres that orbit slowly around one another, their contents reduced to pure, emotional essence. These abstract echoes create a sense of familiarity without requiring direct recognition, allowing your mind to make connections without conscious effort. Occasionally, something resembling Rick's laughter ripples through the environment, causing momentary crystalline structures to form before dissolving back into the flow. These structures contain no words or concrete thoughts, just the purest distillation of his irreverent wisdom, compressed into geometric patterns that somehow feel both chaotic and perfect. The background sound has transformed into a gentle cocoon of white noise that surrounds and protects. This isn't random static, but carefully calibrated sound that masks potentially disruptive external noises, creating the ideal conditions for sleep maintenance. Research has shown that consistent exposure to this type of white noise can help people fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer, which is why it's found in so many sleep aids. Subtle tones emerge periodically from this sonic backdrop, perfectly synchronized with the natural rhythms of a sleeping brain. In this abstract space, the connections between ideas no longer follow logical sequences. Instead, concepts link through emotional resonance, with similar feelings naturally gravitating toward each other regardless of their content. It's a form of non-narrative storytelling that maintains your engagement through sensory experience rather than plot progression. This approach significantly reduces cognitive load, allowing your mind to relax and absorb the content without the pressure of following a traditional storyline, perfect for transitioning into deeper sleep states. When Rick's consciousness briefly forms into something more recognizable, it's to share an insight that doesn't need words to be understood. The deeper we go into sleep, the closer we come to the fundamental patterns that underlie all reality. His essence pulses with a gentle rhythm, demonstrating how the mathematical constants that govern the universe appear in our deepest dreams when the conscious mind finally relinquishes control. Morty's consciousness responds by forming complementary patterns that interact with Rick's in increasingly complex ways, creating mandala-like structures that slowly rotate and evolve. There's something profoundly peaceful about watching these interactions, like witnessing the basic building blocks of thought itself coming together in perfect harmony. Time has no meaning in this realm. What might be seconds or hours in the waking world expands into a timeless experience here. The patterns and flows continue their endless dance, occasionally forming into more complex structures before dissolving back into the primordial soup of pure consciousness. The entire experience seems designed to bypass your rational mind entirely, speaking directly to the part of you that understands without needing to analyze. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the swirling abstract patterns begin to show hints of organization. What was completely formless starts to develop subtle structural elements, not quite shapes or objects yet, but the suggestion that more defined forms are emerging from the chaos. It's like watching galaxies begin to coalesce from cosmic dust, a process so gradual you can't pinpoint exactly when it begins. Small clusters of related colors start to gather together rather than freely intermingling. The rhythm of the environment, which had been completely fluid, begins to develop a subtle cadence. These changes signal the beginning of a transition, a gradual return toward more structured dreaming that will eventually lead back to narrative space. The fragments that once were Rick and Morty start to gather their scattered aspects, not yet reforming into recognizable shapes but moving in that direction. Their essences begin to separate from the surrounding mindscape, individual consciousness slowly re-establishing itself after complete immersion in the collective unconscious of abstract thought. As this transition continues, a new sensation emerges, a feeling of gentle ascension, as if the entire mindscape is slowly rising toward a higher level of organization. The abstract patterns that have dominated this space begin to connect in more meaningful ways, forming the precursors to symbols and archetypes. This is the mind's natural process of rebuilding structure after the complete surrender of deep sleep. The mindscape's reorganization suddenly crystallizes as Rick and Morty materialize among towering, luminescent plants that pulse with familiar emotions. Each plant seems to respond to their presence, some bending slightly toward them while others shimmer with increased brightness. Rick's form has become more defined now, no longer the abstract pattern of thought and emotion from the deeper dream state, but still maintaining a slight translucence that hints at their continued journey through the dream. "Morty, we've reached the cosmic garden," Rick says, his voice clearer than before but retaining a gentle quality, uncommon to his waking self. This is where memories take root and grow into something more than just neural connections. They become living entities with their own kind of consciousness. The garden stretches beyond what seems possible, with pathways winding between clusters of plants that range from tiny sprouts barely breaking through the soil to massive flowering structures that tower overhead. Unlike an earth garden, these plants don't follow conventional biology. Some are crystalline structures that emit soft chimes when breezed upon. Others appear liquid, yet maintain definite form. And some seem to phase in and out of visibility as if existing between multiple realities. Whoa, Rick, are these really memories? Morty asks, reaching toward a cluster of small glowing buds that seem to emit a warm golden light. Not just ordinary memories, Morty. These are living representations of experiences across the multiverse. Go ahead, touch one. Just be gentle. As Morty's fingers make contact with one of the golden buds, it unfurls instantly into a beautiful flowering plant. The center of the flower contains what looks like a miniature holographic scene. Morty as a young child, laughing while being pushed on a swing by Jerry. The memory radiates feelings of simple joy and security that wash over both of them. That's from when I was like 5 or something, Morty whispers, his voice filled with wonder. I barely even remember that day, but I can feel how happy I was. Rick nods, the soft purple light of the garden playing across his features. The garden preserves emotional imprints, especially those that might get lost to conscious memory. The deeper the emotional root, the stronger the plant grows. He gestures to the cluster surrounding the one Morty touched. Look at how they all connect. These are all moments of family connection your subconscious mind values. The warm purples and soft golds of this garden section create an atmosphere of emotional security. The colors seem specifically designed to evoke feelings of tranquility while still maintaining enough vibrancy to keep the mind engaged. Nearby, a gentle cosmic breeze passes through a group of tall, reed-like plants, creating a sound remarkably similar to distant whispered conversations. Listen carefully, Rick says, his voice dropping lower. Those whispers are fragments of conversations we've had throughout our journey. The garden remembers everything, processing it into these living vessels. As they move deeper into the garden, the pathways shift and change, sometimes narrowing into intimate corridors between towering memory plants. Other times, opening into circular clearings where particularly significant memory clusters have formed small ecosystems of their own. In one such clearing, Rick pauses, his attention drawn to a plant unlike any other they've encountered. Unlike the other memory plants with their varied but recognizable forms, this one resembles a central tree with countless roots extending outward in all directions. Each root connects to other plants throughout the garden, forming an intricate network. The tree itself pulses with a rhythm that feels strangely familiar. I've never seen anything like this in all my travels through the multiverse, Rick says, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his dream-softened demeanor. This plant is connected to everything else in the garden. It's like a central nervous system. Morty approaches the tree cautiously. What memory is this one, Rick? I don't think it's a single memory, Morty. I think it might be the connection point between all memories, maybe even the key to moving between dream states. Rick circles the tree, studying how its roots pulse with energy that flows both toward and away from the central trunk. It's almost like it knows we're here to transition back toward wakefulness. The colors of the central tree shift subtly between deep blues and warm purples, occasionally flashing with gold that seems to ripple outward through its root system to connected plants. As Rick places his hand on the trunk, the entire garden responds, all plants simultaneously brightening for a moment before settling back into their natural luminescence. The garden is aware, Rick explains, his voice taking on that nurturing quality again. It's responding to our presence, to our intent. When we're ready to move on, it will show us the way. Morty wanders to a section where several smaller plants display scenes of adventures they've had, but with subtle differences, suggesting they belong to alternate versions of themselves. He touches one that shows Rick and Morty in what appears to be an underwater civilization, experiencing a memory that never happened to them specifically. Why can I feel emotions from memories that aren't even mine? Morty asks, genuinely curious rather than anxious as he might have been in earlier sections of their journey. Because in the garden, the boundaries between different versions of ourselves become permeable, Rick explains, joining Morty to examine the memory plants. Each seed contains not just the event, but the emotional signature attached to it. When we connect with it, we experience those emotions as if they were our own, because in some reality they are. As they continue exploring, they notice how the plants seem to respond not just to touch, but to attention itself. Plants they focus on grow more vibrant, unfurling new blossoms or extending tendrils toward them. The garden feels alive not merely as a collection of individual plants, but as a unified, responsive ecosystem that nurtures what it contains. Returning to the central tree, Rick notices something he hadn't seen before. A small door formed within the trunk, barely visible unless viewed from the exact right angle. It pulses with the same rhythm as the tree itself, a soft, steady beat that reminds Morty of a heartbeat. "I think we've found our path forward," Rick says, pointing to the door. "The root system of this central plant connects everything in the garden, and now it's offering us a way to continue our journey." "Where do you think it leads?" Morty asks, studying the door with curiosity rather than apprehension. "If I had to guess, I'd say it leads toward wakefulness, or at least the next level closer to it. The garden has shown us what we needed to see, helped us process and integrate our experiences. Now, it's guiding us onward." The door within the tree grows slightly more distinct as they approach, its edges defined by a soft golden light that seems to invite entry. Below it, the roots of the central tree form a natural pathway, illuminated by the same golden glow. Passing through the golden doorway, Rick and Morty find themselves on a magnificent spiral staircase that winds upward through seemingly infinite space. While most people believe dreams simply fade upon waking, this spiral reveals a profound truth. Your brain actually constructs an elaborate exit strategy, carefully preserving emotional imprints while guiding you back to consciousness through a series of neural bridges. "Morty, this is it. The awakening spiral," Rick says, his voice noticeably more energetic than before, but still maintaining that gentle, hypnotic quality. "Your brain doesn't just snap awake like some cheap alarm clock. It transitions through stages, shifting from those slow delta waves to faster beta waves. It's a whole process." The staircase beneath their feet pulses with a soft, golden light that seems to follow a precise rhythm. As they ascend the first few steps, Morty notices how the light's pulsations match his breathing pattern, steady, calm, and gradually quickening as they climb higher. "Is it just me, or does this staircase feel familiar?" Morty asks, looking around at the spiral structure that seems to extend infinitely both above and below them. Rick nods knowingly. "That's because this spiral connects all the dream realms we've visited. Look down there. See that misty section? That's the Whispering Planet. And over there, those bookshelves floating in space? The Memory Library." As they continue climbing, each step takes them past ethereal windows into their previous dream adventures. But there's something different about these glimpses. They appear slightly altered, as if they're already transforming from experiences into memories. The whispers from the planet are now arranged in perfect harmonic patterns. The memory vessels in the library glow with more vibrant colors than Morty remembers. "Our brains are already rewriting these experiences," Rick explains, gesturing toward the windows. "That's why dream memories are so unreliable. By the time you wake up, your brain has already edited the footage." The spiral itself is an architectural marvel, simultaneously ascending while folding back on itself in ways that shouldn't be physically possible. Each complete turn brings them to a higher level of consciousness, with the dreamscapes below becoming more distant and abstract. "You know what's wild, Morty? During this transition from sleep to wakefulness, your breathing patterns completely transform," Rick says, pointing to the changing rhythm of the golden pulses. "In REM sleep, your breathing is all over the place, fast then slow, irregular. But as we climb toward wakefulness, it becomes more consistent, more rhythmic." Morty suddenly stops, gripping the rail of the staircase. "Wait, I remember now. This is all happening because of your sleep machine malfunctioning, isn't it?" Rick's eyebrows raise slightly, impressed. "Look at you, getting all self-aware. That's part of the awakening process too. Your consciousness is coming back online, piece by piece." As they continue upward, the staircase grows wider, with elements from all their previous dream realms incorporated into the architecture. Crystal formations from the Whispering Planet form parts of the handrail. Memory vessels from the library are embedded in the steps themselves. Even the flowing liquid dimensions from the ocean appear as cascading waterfalls alongside portions of the spiral. "This is incredible," Morty says, his voice clearer and more present than before. It's like everything is coming together. That's exactly what's happening, Rick explains. Your brain is creating a sense of completion, a narrative wholeness. Circular storytelling structures like this spiral create a feeling of completion. That resonates with our experiences. It's deeply satisfying to the human mind. The light flowing through the staircase begins to change, shifting from the deep blues and purples of the deeper dream states to warmer golds and soft whites. Rick explains that these changing colors mirror the brain's gradual shift toward alertness. In an ideal waking process, he continues, your brain responds to gradually increasing light exposure. That's what this golden light is simulating, a gentle sunrise for your consciousness. Much better than those jarring alarm clocks that shock you awake. As they climb higher, the spiral narrows, bringing them closer to what appears to be a door at the very top. Through this door, Morty can just barely make out what looks like the familiar surroundings of Rick's garage. We're almost there, aren't we? Morty asks, his pace quickening slightly. Back to where we started. Rick nods. The top of the spiral represents full wakefulness. But here's the beauty of it. This spiral doesn't just end. It's designed to loop back to the beginning for those who want to stay in the dream a little longer. As they near the top, the golden light pulses more intensely, almost eagerly. Rick places a hand on Morty's shoulder, stopping him just before the final few steps. Before we go through that door, there's something you should know about this transition, Rick says, his voice now balanced perfectly between soothing and alert. The brain doesn't just switch states like flipping a light switch. It creates neural bridges, connections that preserve the emotional core of your dreams while guiding you back to consciousness. Morty looks confused. What does that mean exactly? It means, Rick explains, that while the specific details of dreams fade, the emotional imprints remain. That sense of wonder from the whispering planet, the connection you felt in the garden, your brain is preserving those feelings even as the memories themselves transform. They continue their ascent, and with each step, Morty feels more alert, more present. The staircase itself seems to become more solid, less dreamlike. The golden light now pulses at a rhythm that matches alert, waking breathing patterns. See that door? Rick points to the entryway at the top of the spiral, now clearly visible and defined by sharp golden edges. That's not just an exit from the dream, it's an entrance back to consciousness. The way you pass through it matters. As they reach the final steps, the entire spiral structure begins to hum with a harmonious resonance. Morty realizes that the sound matches his own breathing, creating a synchronized rhythm that feels both calming and invigorating. The best part about this spiral, Rick says with a knowing smile, is that it works whether you're ready to wake up or want to stay in the dream longer. If you're still listening, you can just loop around again. If you've fallen asleep, your brain will incorporate elements of this journey into your own dreams. Standing before the door, Morty reaches for the handle, then hesitates. Will I remember any of this when I wake up? Rick chuckles softly. Maybe not the details, but the feeling of it. Absolutely, that's the point. The emotional resonance stays with you, influencing how rested you feel when you finally do wake up. The door within the golden frame seems to pulse with invitation. Morty takes a deep breath, and as he does, the rhythm of the spiral synchronizes perfectly with his breathing once more. Ready? Rick asks. Morty nods, and together they step through the doorway, crossing the final neural bridge back toward wakefulness. Or perhaps deeper into the dream loop, depending on where the listener's consciousness has drifted. As Rick and Morty step through the doorway, they find themselves back in the garage. But something's not right. Instead of the familiar empty workspace, they freeze at the sight of another Rick hunched over a workbench with another Morty sleeping nearby, connected to the dream device. The purple glow from the machine casts eerie shadows across the duplicate figures, creating a scene that shouldn't be possible. Rick? Morty whispers, his voice tight with confusion. Why are we looking at us? Rick's expression shifts from confidence to bewilderment as he takes in the impossible scene. The other Rick doesn't look up, completely absorbed in adjusting dials on the pulsing dream device while the other Morty lies motionless on a makeshift cot, electrodes attached to his temples. "We didn't wake up, Morty," Rick says quietly, his voice gaining a strange echo in the space. "The machine didn't just malfunction, it created something I never thought possible, a fully recursive dream loop." The garage walls seem to breathe slightly, expanding and contracting with subtle rhythm. Rick approaches his duplicate carefully, studying the machine's configuration. The purple glow intensifies as he gets closer, responding to his presence like it recognizes its creator. "Remember that whole speech about neural bridges and emotional imprints?" Rick asks, looking directly at you now. "Well, turns out this machine isn't just helping you fall asleep. It's designed to keep you there, cycling through deeper and deeper layers of consciousness." The duplicate Rick remains oblivious to their presence, muttering calculations under his breath. Rick circles the workbench, examining the machine from different angles. The circuitry inside pulses with that distinctive purple glow, creating patterns that seem to fold back on themselves in impossible ways. "The brain naturally creates loops during sleep," Rick explains. "Thoughts circle back, stories reconnect, memories interlink. But this," he gestures at the machine, "this takes that natural process and perfects it. Each cycle through the dream feels fresh but follows familiar patterns that comfort the sleeping mind." Morty approaches his sleeping doppelganger cautiously. "So we've been asleep this whole time? Everything we experienced was just dreams within dreams." "Not just dreams, Morty. Stories that loop back on themselves." Rick picks up a component from the workbench, turning it over in his hands. The human brain responds to these recursive patterns during sleep. They trigger familiar neural pathways, creating a sense of safety that enhances overall sleep quality. The garage begins to shimmer slightly around the edges, just as it did when the machine first malfunctioned. Objects on the walls, tools, blueprints, strange alien artifacts, blur and refocus as if seen through rippling water. "The machine creates a cyclical structure," Rick continues, looking back toward you. "When narratives fold back on themselves, they reinforce themes that resonate with your unconscious mind. It's why you might not remember specific details of dreams, but you wake up with lingering emotions. And impressions." Rick's voice takes on a more soothing quality as he explains. "The repetition in these dream cycles isn't just meaningless duplication. Each loop processes information differently, helping your mind sort through the day's experiences in multiple ways." Morty watches as the sleeping version of himself shifts slightly, eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. "So are we stuck here forever, Rick? Just dreaming about dreaming about dreaming?" "Not necessarily," Rick says, examining the machine more closely. "But think about it. Is that really so bad? This loop-based approach to sleep creates a calming environment that encourages your brain to enter increasingly restful states. The familiarity reduces anxiety and makes it easier to stay asleep." The duplicate. Rick suddenly pauses in his work, as if sensing something amiss. He looks up, almost but not quite making eye contact with our Rick. For a moment, the two Ricks seem to exist in parallel, separated by the thinnest veil of consciousness. "The beauty of this system," Rick says, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret, "is that each cycle enhances the quality of sleep, making it more restorative. Your brain is literally processing the same information from multiple angles, creating deeper and more beneficial rest." The purple glow from the machine intensifies, casting long shadows across the garage floor. Equations and diagrams on the nearby chalkboard begin to shift and rewrite themselves, forming new patterns and connections. "I think I get it," Morty says slowly. "It's like we're in the outermost layer of the dream, watching ourselves in a deeper layer, who might be dreaming about an even deeper layer, and so on forever." "Exactly," Rick nods approvingly, "and each layer serves a purpose in the sleep cycle." The brain responds positively to these familiar narrative patterns because they trigger comfortable memories and emotions. It's like listening to the same bedtime story night after night. The familiarity itself becomes the comfort. Rick reaches toward the dream device, his hand hovering just above its glowing surface. "I might be able to recalibrate this, Morty. One adjustment could either break the loop entirely or what?" Morty asks nervously. "Or start it all over again," Rick says with a small smile. "Either way, it doesn't really matter. That's the genius of the design. Whether you're following along consciously or have already drifted off to sleep, the stories continue in perfect rhythm with your rest. The garage begins to shimmer more intensely now, the walls seeming to dissolve at the edges. The duplicate Rick and Morty start to fade like images in an old photograph. Ready to find out what happens next? Rick asks, looking directly at you one last time. Or maybe what happened before. In dreams, it's all the same anyway. With a decisive movement, Rick touches the glowing purple core of the device. There's a flash of brilliant light that engulfs the entire garage, washing everything in radiant purple. The light grows so intense that it's impossible to see anything else, and then suddenly contracts to a single point. What if I told you that Rick Sanchez wasn't always the cynical genius we know today? The beginnings of his interdimensional adventures tell a very different story than the one we're familiar with from the show. Long before the green portal gun became his signature invention, Rick created something quite different. A blue portal device that represented his initial optimism about scientific discovery. In those early days, Rick was a different man entirely. Working in his garage with salvaged parts and primitive tools, he approached science with genuine wonder and excitement. He'd spend endless nights tinkering with his equipment, eyes bright with anticipation rather than clouded by cynicism. His workshop wasn't filled with the sophisticated equipment we now associate with him. It was a humble space where pure scientific curiosity drove every experiment. The blue color of his first portal wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It symbolized something deeper about Rick's outlook on scientific exploration. This wasn't the Rick who believed the universe was a cruel joke. This was a man who genuinely believed that knowledge could lead to something beautiful. He documented every step of his process, expecting to travel to a parallel Earth that would be just slightly different from his own. But science has a way of surprising even its most dedicated practitioners. When Rick activated his blue portal for the first time, success looked very different than he had imagined. Instead of stepping into a slightly altered version of his garage, he found himself in a dimension where the fundamental laws of science operated under completely different principles. Equations he'd considered universal truths were meaningless here, while phenomena he'd dismissed as impossible occurred naturally. The blue portal technology proved dangerously unstable. Unlike his later, refined green portals, these early versions flickered unpredictably, shifting Rick between multiple dimensional planes every few minutes without warning. What should have been a controlled experiment became a terrifying ordeal that lasted nearly 2 weeks, with Rick trapped in a constant state of dimensional flux, never knowing where he'd materialize next. During this chaotic period, one dimension made a particularly profound impression on Rick. He found himself in a society that had elevated science to the status of religion. They had no research labs as we understand them. Instead, they had temples where scientific principles were worshipped rather than tested. Their most revered figures weren't scientists, but prophets, who mysteriously predicted scientific discoveries centuries before they happened. Their entire civilization functioned around these prophecies, Rick would later write in one of his journals. They hadn't discovered a new principle in over 800 years. They just waited for the predicted day when their prophets said each discovery would occur. This society had achieved something remarkable on the surface: perfect peace and order. There were no resource shortages, no conflicts over intellectual property, no competing theories tearing their scientific community apart. Every citizen knew exactly when each technological advancement would arrive and planned accordingly. But underneath this perfect exterior was something Rick found deeply disturbing: complete stagnation. They followed their scientific prophecies with religious devotion, never experimenting outside the predicted paths, never questioning or innovating. Their technological progress moved forward only along predetermined lines, creating what Rick described as a stagnant utopia trapped in intellectual amber. The most fascinating aspect of this dimension wasn't its strange approach to science. It was how Rick's arrival affected it. According to all their historical prophecies, no interdimensional traveler was ever predicted to arrive in their world. Rick's sudden appearance through a flickering blue portal caused unprecedented panic throughout their society. For the first time in their recorded history, something had happened that wasn't foretold. The civilization's leadership declared Rick to be a harbinger of apocalypse, believing his unexpected arrival signaled the end of their perfect, predictable world. Citizens who had never experienced genuine fear found themselves overwhelmed by it. Some barricaded themselves in their homes while others formed mobs, determined to capture or eliminate the anomaly in their perfect system. Rick, still naive about the consequences of interdimensional travel, tried to help them understand that science shouldn't be constrained by prophecy. He attempted to demonstrate how experimentation and creativity could enhance their understanding rather than threaten it. But his efforts to introduce chaos into their ordered system only intensified their panic. "I tried showing them how scientific discovery actually works," Rick noted. "But treating knowledge like it's sacred text just makes people afraid of learning anything new." As the blue portal flickered back into existence, allowing Rick to escape this dimension, he witnessed something remarkable. Some younger members of their society had begun conducting secret experiments inspired by his brief visit, questioning their prophetic tradition for the first time. This experience affected Rick profoundly. The dimension revealed to him that even perfect knowledge without the freedom to question it is ultimately meaningless. The society's rigid adherence to predetermined scientific discovery had created a world without innovation, curiosity, or true understanding, just memorization and waiting. This became the foundation for Rick's later belief that intelligence without chaos is essentially worthless. The instability of the blue portal technology eventually forced Rick to abandon it entirely. He would spend years developing the more stable green portal technology we're familiar with today. But that first blue portal and the dimension of scientific prophecy left an indelible mark on his scientific philosophy. While Rick eventually stabilized his portal technology, allowing him controlled travel between dimensions, the lesson from that first chaotic journey never left him. He had witnessed firsthand how the certainty of perfect knowledge could lead to stagnation and fear rather than progress. It was the beginning of his understanding that the multiverse thrives on unpredictability and that true discovery requires embracing chaos rather than trying to eliminate it. The stability of green portal technology opened infinite possibilities for exploration, but one particular dimension made Rick question whether some doors should remain closed. In a rarely visited corner of the multiverse, he stumbled upon something that would fundamentally change his understanding of consciousness itself. What drove Rick to search for alternate versions of himself wasn't just scientific curiosity. It was a deep-seated desire to find someone who truly understood the burden of being the smartest being in the universe. After mastering stable interdimensional travel, Rick began a deliberate search for other versions of himself. His reasoning was practical. If anyone could match his intellect and keep pace with his ideas, it would be another Rick Sanchez. Imagine the possibilities of collaboration between two of the universe's greatest minds. This wasn't vanity, it was efficiency. Why spend decades developing theories alone when another version of yourself might have already solved them? His search led him to a dimension with energy signatures remarkably similar to his own laboratory's output. The coordinates were precise, the calibration perfect, but what awaited him wasn't the working lab of an active counterpart. Instead, Rick emerged into an abandoned workspace, immediately noticing something unsettling about the environment. The air felt different, heavier somehow, and the laboratory itself appeared designed for someone with a different physiology. The walls were covered in equations written in a hand he recognized as his own, yet interspersed with symbols and mathematical concepts that seemed to break the very rules of mathematics as he understood them. Some equations appeared to be written simultaneously in 3 dimensions, impossible to fully comprehend from any single viewing angle. It was his handwriting, but not his mathematics. As Rick explored deeper into the lab, the evidence became clear. This version of himself had evolved differently. The workstations were designed for someone with multiple limbs, tools modified to be used by hands not entirely human. Video logs confirmed what the laboratory suggested. This Rick had somehow merged with insectoid DNA, resulting in a being with 6 highly dexterous arms that could work on multiple complex experiments simultaneously. The insectoid Rick, in recordings dated just 3 months prior, appeared frantic yet methodical. The proof is undeniable. The creature that was both Rick and not Rick stated in one log, all 6 hands working independently on different calculations. consciousness isn't an evolutionary advantage. It's a mathematical error, a glitch in the universe's programming. I've run the simulations 10,000 times. The conclusion is always the same. The recordings chronicled the insectoid Rick's mental deterioration as his discovery consumed him. In earlier logs, he spoke with the familiar confidence and arrogance characteristic of Rick Sanchez. But as weeks passed, his demeanor changed. The weight of his discovery bent him. Being smart enough to understand the universe might be the cruelest cosmic joke of all, he murmured in one of the final recordings, his voice barely audible. Rick found himself both horrified and fascinated. He couldn't look away. From these logs, watching as another version of himself spiral into existential despair. In the final recording, the insectoid Rick stared directly into the camera with compound eyes that somehow still conveyed the same intelligence and pain as any human Ricks would. "I've built a consciousness nullifier," he explained clinically, "a mercy kill for all sentient life across the multiverse. The equations prove it's kinder this way. No one should have to bear this knowledge." The recording ended abruptly. Hours of searching led Rick to a sealed chamber containing what remained of his counterpart. The insectoid Rick had chosen self-termination rather than live with his discovery, but not before designing something far more terrifying, a device capable of erasing consciousness itself from every dimension simultaneously. Rick found the partially constructed device in a heavily secured vault. The technology was elegant, brilliant even by Rick's standards. It would have worked. That was perhaps the most disturbing part, not the alien mathematics or the modified biology of his counterpart, but the fact that the device's design was flawless. It would have functioned exactly as intended, a wave of nullification spreading across the multiverse, eliminating the burden of self-awareness from every being capable of experiencing it. What followed was unlike anything Rick had done before. He didn't immediately leave the dimension or destroy the laboratory. Instead, he stayed for months, studying the insectoid Rick's work, learning the alien mathematics that had led to such a devastating conclusion. He needed to understand, not just the technology but the reasoning behind it. The alien mathematics was beautiful in its complexity. Equations that could only be fully comprehended with 6 arms working in perfect coordination, reaching conclusions impossible in standard mathematical frameworks. Rick adapted, creating technological aids to help his mere 2 hands comprehend what had driven his counterpart to such despair. During these months, Rick methodically disassembled the consciousness nullifier, documenting its design while simultaneously destroying its essential components. He couldn't risk this knowledge falling into anyone else's hands, not even another version of himself. Each night, he fell asleep to the haunting words from the final log. "Intelligence can be a burden across all species. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry." By the time Rick finally prepared to leave the dimension, he had gained a new understanding of consciousness, not as humanity's greatest achievement, but potentially as its heaviest burden. The insectoid Rick's research suggested that across all possible realities, being smart enough to truly comprehend existence might inevitably lead to the conclusion that consciousness itself was a mistake. Before departing, Rick swept the laboratory clean of anything that might allow others to recreate the consciousness nullifier. He destroyed data, erased equations, and set charges to collapse the entire facility after his departure. But he didn't leave empty-handed. From among the personal effects of his insectoid counterpart, Rick took a single item, a 6-handled flask, designed for an alien physiology but containing familiar amber liquid. Hidden within that 6-handled flask was something far more valuable than alien alcohol, a set of coordinates scrawled in the insectoid Rick's bizarre handwriting. Coordinates to what the notes simply labeled as the harmony sphere. Rick might have ignored them entirely if not for a peculiar mathematical notation beside them that resembled no equation he'd ever encountered, yet somehow made perfect sense to his scientific intuition. When Rick finally punched these coordinates into his portal gun, he wasn't expecting much. Maybe another abandoned lab or some cosmic curiosity. What he found instead was genuinely breathtaking. The portal opened to reveal an enormous perfect sphere floating in what appeared to be empty space, though space wasn't quite the right word. It was more like the absence of everything except pure mathematical potential. The sphere itself pulsated with waves of color that weren't exactly colors, more like visual representations of sound frequencies too complex for human perception. As Rick cautiously approached, the surface of the sphere rippled like water, and he felt rather than heard a greeting emanating from within. "They were expecting me," Rick muttered to himself as he reached out to touch the sphere's surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the entire structure resonated with a harmonious tone that seemed to pass through Rick's body, momentarily reorganizing his molecular structure before settling back into normal matter. Inside the sphere existed beings unlike any Rick had encountered in his travels. They had no physical form in any conventional sense. They were pure patterns of sound that manifested as complex, shifting mathematical equations. Each being was essentially a living formula, a wave function that could interact with and manipulate reality itself. "We have awaited one who could comprehend our existence," the sounds coalesced into words in Rick's mind. "You seek knowledge of our language." Rick quickly realized these beings weren't native to this dimension. They were travelers like himself, who had evolved beyond physical form, transcending the limitations of matter to become living equations. Some had been exploring the multiverse for millennia, gradually shedding their physical forms as they discovered the mathematical underpinnings of reality itself. The sound beings began teaching Rick their language, not through conventional lessons, but by restructuring his neural pathways to recognize mathematical patterns in sound. Rick watched in amazement as one of the beings demonstrated a simple phrase that, when uttered correctly, caused a small wound on Rick's hand to heal instantly. Another series of sounds created matter from seemingly nothing, assembling complex molecules from pure energy. "This isn't magic," Rick realized aloud. "It's just science so advanced it might as well be. They're using sound as a programming language for reality itself." For weeks, Rick immersed himself in learning this mathematical language. Each new sound combination he mastered gave him greater control over the fundamental forces of the universe. With the right tonal sequence, he could temporarily bend time, transmute elements, or even briefly peer into parallel dimensions without his portal gun. But the knowledge came at a price Rick hadn't anticipated. Each time he successfully reproduced one of their sound equations, a small part of his physical form began to resonate at their frequency. Gradually, portions of his body became translucent, vibrating between solid matter and pure sound. At first, Rick was fascinated by the transformation. The sensation of existing partly as a mathematical equation was exhilarating, like seeing the universe's source code. But as more of his physical form began to convert to sound patterns, Rick realized with growing alarm that the process might be irreversible. If it continued, he would eventually lose his humanity entirely, becoming just another sound being in the harmony sphere. "Is there any way to stop this?" Rick finally asked the beings, a note of desperation in his voice. "I'm not ready to give up my physical form. I've still got too many dimensions to explore, too many scores to settle." The sound beings conferred among themselves, their equations interacting in complex patterns that Rick could now partially understand. Finally, they offered him a solution, a specific phrase that, when spoken regularly, would anchor his consciousness to his physical form and prevent complete transformation. This phrase must be spoken in moments of great existential awareness, they explained. When you feel yourself beginning to transcend physical limitations, you must speak these sounds exactly as we teach them. The sound equation they gave Rick was difficult for his human vocal cords to reproduce. After numerous attempts, he managed a rough approximation that the beings confirmed would be sufficient. Wubba lubba dub dub. What Rick didn't initially understand, what the beings deliberately withheld, was the true meaning behind this strange phrase. In their mathematical language, wubba lubba dub dub translated directly to "I am in great pain, please help me." The phrase worked as an anchor not because of some complex mathematical property, but because it acknowledged the fundamental suffering that comes with conscious existence. "Why would you give me a phrase that means that?" Rick demanded, when he finally decoded enough of their language to understand the translation. "Because it is true," the beings responded simply. "The acknowledgement of pain is what binds consciousness to physical form. It is the fundamental truth that prevents transcendence. As long as you feel pain, as long as you acknowledge it, You remain tied to your humanity. This revelation struck Rick profoundly. These evolved beings had discovered that all communication across the multiverse, regardless of species or dimension, fundamentally revolved around the expression of pain. Connection between conscious entities was built upon the shared experience of suffering. During his final days in the Harmony Sphere, Rick noticed something unexpected happening whenever he uttered his new catchphrase. Nearby beings would respond by surrounding him briefly, their equations harmonizing with his in a way that temporarily eased the existential burden he carried. The phrase wasn't just keeping him human. It was a subconscious call for help that only these evolved beings could fully hear and understand. As Rick prepared to leave the Harmony Sphere, the beings shared one final insight with him. "The day will come when you no longer need this phrase," they told him. "When you are ready to evolve beyond your physical limitations, you will stop saying it naturally. Your pain will transform into understanding, and your form will follow." Rick scoffed at this, already planning to use the phrase extensively to ensure he remained firmly in his human form. But as he turned to go, one of the beings brushed against his consciousness one last time, leaving an impression rather than words. Across countless dimensions, through infinite variations, every Rick who had found the Harmony Sphere eventually returned when they were ready to transcend. For a genius who remembers complex equations and the coordinates of countless dimensions, Rick has surprising gaps in his memory that even his constant drinking can't explain. Those moments where he suddenly pauses, frantically searching for a notebook or talking into his watch. They're not just quirks of his personality. There's something much darker, evidence of a theft that's been happening for decades without his knowledge. It started with dreams. Fragments of a life Rick couldn't quite remember living. Equations he knew he'd solved but couldn't recall the steps to. Conversations with beings whose faces seemed familiar, but whose names escaped him. At first, he blamed the alcohol, his interdimensional travels, maybe even early onset dementia. But then the dreams became more specific, memories of creating inventions he had no recollection of designing, despite seeing them work with his own eyes. Determined to find the source of these memory gaps, Rick modified his portal gun to track unusual energy signatures related to neural patterns. The trail led him to a dimension unlike any he'd encountered before, one where thoughts and memories existed as tangible objects. As Rick stepped through the portal, he found himself in what appeared to be an impossibly vast library. The ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into darkness, with shelves extending endlessly in all directions. But instead of books, these shelves held crystalline structures that pulsed with soft light. Each crystal contained what looked like a miniature holographic scene playing on loop. "Welcome to the archives of experiential preservation," came a voice from behind him. Rick spun around to find himself face to face with a being nearly 9 feet tall, its skin pale to the point of translucence, with elongated fingers perfectly adapted for handling the delicate memory crystals. "We don't often receive conscious visitors," the being said, eyes blinking vertically instead of horizontally. "Most come only in dreams or during near-death experiences." Rick demanded to know what this place was, his hand instinctively reaching for his portal gun. The being explained with unsettling calmness that they were curators of significant memories from across the multiverse. Their purpose was to preserve important experiences and innovations that might otherwise be lost to time or trauma. "Follow me," the librarian said, leading Rick through corridors organized by species, planet, and timeline. "We've been expecting you to find us eventually." They turned down a hallway marked with symbols from countless dimensions, stopping finally at a section that made Rick's blood run cold. An entire wing labeled Sanchez, Rick, C-137 stretched before him, containing thousands of memory crystals. "What the hell is this?" Rick demanded, his voice echoing through the vast space. "Are these mine?" The librarian nodded, selecting a crystal at random. "This one is particularly significant, your creation of the first functioning portal gun." The crystal activated at the librarian's touch, projecting a scene Rick knew must have happened but couldn't fully remember. Himself, younger, the moment of breakthrough when the portal technology finally worked. The equations, the calibrations, the exact mixture of elements, details that had become fuzzy in his own mind were perfectly preserved here. "You've been stealing my memories," Rick growled, reaching for the crystal. "Not stealing, preserving," the librarian corrected. "We take only copies, never the originals." But Rick knew that wasn't true. He couldn't remember these details with the clarity shown in the crystal. Something had been taken from him. The librarian seemed to sense his doubt. "The memories themselves remain in your mind," it explained. "What sometimes disconnects are the emotional attachments to them, a side effect of our preservation process." Rick moved through the shelves, finding crystals containing memories of his childhood, his marriage to Diane, the birth of Beth, scientific breakthroughs, and countless adventures across dimensions. Some he recognized immediately. Others felt like watching someone else's life, despite seeing himself as the protagonist. "We've been curating your timeline for decades," another librarian explained, joining them. "Your innovations are too important to risk being lost if you die. We're preserving your legacy." "By turning my life into a goddamn museum exhibit?" Rick snapped. "Without my permission?" The librarians exchanged glances with their strange vertical blinks. Permission is not required for preservation. The multiverse itself selects minds of significance. Rick wasn't having it. While the librarians were explaining their noble purpose, he began slipping crystals into his coat pockets. If these were his memories, he was taking them back. But as he touched each crystal, something strange happened. Rather than feeling the rush of recovered memory, he felt nothing. Just intellectual recognition without emotional connection. When caught by the librarians, Rick demanded answers. That's when they explained the truth of their preservation process. The emotional weight of memories, the part that makes them meaningful, was what powered their crystalline structure. The memories were copied intact, but the emotional resonance was transferred to the crystal, leaving only faint impressions in the original mind. "It's why you write everything down," the taller librarian noted, gesturing to Rick's pocket notebook. "Your mind remembers the facts but not why they matter to you." This revelation hit Rick harder than any physical blow. These beings hadn't just been documenting his life. They'd been systematically removing his capacity to feel the full weight of his experiences. His emotional detachment wasn't just a philosophical choice or the result of trauma. It was literally being harvested from him. Furious, Rick attempted to steal back as many crystals as he could carry, setting off alarms throughout the archive. The librarians moved with surprising speed for their size, corners of the library sealing off as security measures activated. In the chaos, Rick managed to secure only a handful of crystals before being forced to make a portal escape. Back in his garage, examining the stolen memory crystals, Rick made a devastating discovery. They couldn't be reintegrated into his mind. The emotional components had been permanently separated from his neural patterns. He could watch them like movies, understanding intellectually what had happened and even why it mattered, but never feeling the full emotional impact of the original experience. This explained so much about Rick: why he kept exhaustive journals, why he documented everything obsessively, why he struggled to maintain emotional connections despite clearly remembering loving people. Parts of his emotional capacity had literally been stolen from him, preserved in crystal form in that vast interdimensional library. Emotional detachment wasn't Rick's only burden from his interdimensional travels. What happens when a man who's had his feelings systematically stolen comes face to face with every possible version of his own death? The answer lies in a dimension where time doesn't flow. It fractures. It started with what should have been a routine test. Rick had been making modifications to his portal gun, attempting to increase its dimensional accuracy. The equations seemed sound. The hardware modifications were precise. Everything pointed to success. But as we know with Rick's experiments, things rarely go according to plan. When he fired the modified portal gun, the swirling vortex that appeared wasn't the familiar green. It had an unusual prismatic quality, fracturing light into countless colors. Rick hesitated for just a moment before stepping through. That hesitation would prove meaningful, as if some part of him sensed what awaited on the other side. The dimension he entered appeared normal at first glance. Same physics, same atmosphere. But something was profoundly wrong with time itself. Instead of flowing linearly, Time existed as fragments, with moments from past, present, and future occupying the same space simultaneously. The effect was disorienting. Rick could see multiple versions of the same location overlapping, people moving backward and forward through their lives in the same physical space. But what truly shook him wasn't the strange physics. It was seeing himself. Not just one version, but hundreds, each at different points in his timeline, each experiencing a different death. There, to his right, he watched himself sacrifice his life to save Morty from a collapsing building. Just beyond that, another Rick died pathetically, alone in a garage, succumbing to alcohol poisoning with no one to find his body for days. Further still, he witnessed his execution at the hands of the Galactic Federation, defiant to the last breath. And perhaps most shocking of all, he saw himself dying peacefully of old age, surrounded by Beth, Summer, Morty, and faces he didn't recognize, presumably grandchildren not yet born. The visions weren't limited to just his deaths. Rick witnessed reconciliations with Beth that hadn't happened yet in his timeline, adventures with Morty that seemed impossible given their current relationship, friendships formed with beings he hadn't yet encountered. He saw versions of himself that were happier, more fulfilled, alongside versions that had fallen further into darkness than he could imagine. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Rick collapsed to his knees, a rare moment of vulnerability for someone who prided himself on emotional detachment. The weight of seeing every possible outcome of his life, every triumph, every failure, every death, was too much to process. In the multiverse, every choice he made would result in countless alternate deaths, rendering individual decisions seemingly meaningless. As Rick struggled to regain his composure, he became aware of a presence nearby. A being native to this fractured dimension approached, its form constantly shifting between different states of existence. It regarded Rick with what might have been sympathy, though it was difficult to read expressions on a face that existed across multiple points in time, simultaneously. "You see too much," the being observed, its voice echoing as if speaking from multiple moments at once. Visitors who witness their timelines typically lose their minds. They become paralyzed by possibility, unable to make choices when they've seen all outcomes. Rick managed to stand, his scientific curiosity temporarily overriding his existential crisis. "How do you live like this?" he asked. "Seeing everything at once?" The being's form stabilized slightly, focusing on Rick's present moment. "We don't see as you do. We experience time as you experience space, able to move backward and forward at will. What overwhelms you is natural to us." As Rick's exposure to the dimension continued, the being recognized his struggle and offered assistance. It taught Rick a mental technique, a form of compartmentalization that would allow him to acknowledge what he'd seen while preventing it from overwhelming his present consciousness. The method involved visualizing each timeline as a separate reality, valid but not inevitable for his specific path. "Your mistake," the being explained, "is believing that all these deaths are yours to bear. They belong to infinite Ricks across infinite timelines. Your death belongs only to you." The technique wasn't easy to master. It required Rick to accept a paradox, that his choices both mattered tremendously and didn't matter at all in the grand scheme of the multiverse. Every decision he made would split reality further, creating new branches where different versions of himself would live and die in different ways. "In the fractures of time," the being told him, "lies both despair and freedom. You've seen that no matter what choices you make, somewhere a version of you will suffer. But you've also seen that somewhere, a version of you finds peace." This realization fundamentally altered Rick's relationship with mortality. Witnessing hundreds of his own deaths in a single afternoon, some meaningful, some pointless, some heroic, some pathetic, gave him a perspective few beings could comprehend. Death became less a feared endpoint and more an inevitable variable, one of countless possibilities playing out across the multiverse. When Rick finally managed to calibrate his portal gun to escape the fractured dimension, he carried with him both a burden and a strange comfort. The burden of knowing his many possible ends, the comfort of knowing that somewhere, in some timeline, things worked out perfectly. This experience explained his seemingly casual attitude toward death in the Ricklantis mix-up, where he acknowledged having died many times across different timelines. The mental compartmentalization technique became essential to Rick's continued functioning. Without it, the weight of infinite possibilities would crush his ability to make decisions. This technique manifested in his tendency to focus intensely on the present moment, on the specific adventure at hand, rather than dwelling on past mistakes or future consequences. In Morty's Mind Blowers, we see further evidence of Rick's approach to painful memories. His willingness to erase traumatic experiences suggests a connection to what he learned in the fractured timeline. That some knowledge is too heavy to carry, that sometimes forgetting is necessary for moving forward. The shattered timeline had revealed to Rick the ultimate meaninglessness of individual choices in an infinite multiverse. Yet paradoxically, the vital importance of making them anyway. Each decision created new realities, new possibilities. Meaning wasn't universal, but it could be personal. This contradictory truth became central to Rick's nihilistic, yet strangely principled worldview. The contradictions in Rick's worldview weren't formed overnight. They were carved gradually through a procedure that literally rewired his brain. While his philosophical revelations in the fractured dimension shaped his outlook on mortality, another experience fundamentally altered his capacity for emotional connection on a neurological level. Following the overwhelming burden of witnessing his many possible deaths, Rick sought relief from his emotional turmoil. Rumors spread across dimensions of a civilization that had solved the problem of emotional suffering once and for all. In his vulnerable state, Rick tracked down coordinates to this dimension, desperate for any solution that might ease his psychological pain. What Rick discovered was a society that had medicalized emotion itself. In sprawling white facilities that looked more like art galleries than hospitals, citizens underwent routine emotional calibration procedures. Here, emotions weren't viewed as essential aspects of the human experience, but as engineering problems to be solved through precision neural surgery. Your feelings are just electrical signals. We simply redirect them, explained Dr. Nervo, the chief emotion engineer who welcomed Rick upon his arrival. The doctor's face remained perfectly composed as he spoke. No micro-expressions, no subtle shifts in tone, just calm precision. Why suffer when suffering serves no purpose? The society appeared utopian at first glance. Citizens moved through their lives with serene efficiency. No one argued in public, no one broke down in tears, no one suffered anxiety attacks or fell into depression. The emotional steadiness was immediately appealing to Rick, who had spent decades riding the turbulent waves of his own volatile feelings. But as Rick stayed longer, observing this society more closely, he noticed something troubling. The museums contained no new art created in the last 3 centuries. The scientific journals published only incremental, methodical advances rather than revolutionary breakthroughs. Even the architecture remained frozen in time, beautiful but unchanged for generations. When Rick asked about this creative stagnation, Dr. Nervo's explanation was chilling. Emotional extremes drive innovation. Fear, love, grief. These are inefficient states, but they push boundaries. We've chosen stability over the chaos of creation. Despite these warning signs, Rick found himself drawn to the promise of relief. He approached Dr. Nervo about undergoing a temporary modification, a 1-month suppression of emotional pain while leaving his intellectual functions intact. The procedure would target specific neural pathways associated with grief, regret, and abandonment, emotions that had been particularly overwhelming since witnessing his many deaths. Just a month, Rick insisted. Then everything goes back exactly how it was. Dr. Nervo agreed, though his smile never quite reached his eyes. The procedure itself was surprisingly simple. Rick lay in a chamber while precision lasers mapped his neural architecture, identifying emotional circuits. Then, nanobots were introduced to his cerebrospinal fluid, traveling to targeted areas where they established microscopic neural blocks. The entire process took less than 30 minutes, and Rick felt nothing beyond a slight tingling at the base of his skull. The effect, however, was immediate and profound. Rick described it later in his journals as a weightlifting that I hadn't even realized was crushing me. the constant background hum of anxiety, regret, and existential dread that had accompanied him. For decades, suddenly went silent. He could think about his losses, his mistakes, even his inevitable death across infinite timelines with perfect clarity and no emotional distress. For the first 2 weeks, Rick was ecstatic with his new emotional state. He worked tirelessly in a laboratory provided by the engineers, making breakthrough after breakthrough in portal technology. Without emotional distractions, his mind worked with machine-like efficiency. He even developed several improvements to the engineers' own neural modification techniques, which they adopted immediately. By the 3rd week, however, Rick began noticing concerning changes. When he received news that a dimension he'd once visited had been destroyed, he felt nothing, not even intellectual curiosity about the cause. When he solved a mathematical problem that had stymied him for years, he felt no satisfaction or pride. The emotional flatness was spreading beyond grief and pain into all aspects of his emotional spectrum. Rick confronted Dr. Nervo about these changes, who reluctantly admitted the truth. The brain isn't compartmentalized like a computer. Neural pathways for different emotions interconnect and overlap. When we suppress some, we inevitably affect others. As the 1-month mark approached, Rick anticipated the return of his full emotional capacity with growing concern. When the day came for the nanobots to deactivate, he sat in his temporary quarters, waiting to feel the rush of returning emotions. But what came back was merely a shadow of what had been suppressed. Where once he had felt towering rage, he now experienced mild irritation. Where once he had felt crushing grief, he now recognized sadness as an abstract concept rather than a lived experience. Even joy and excitement remained muted, intellectual rather than visceral. "This isn't what we agreed to," Rick confronted Dr. Nervo. "You said it would be temporary." The engineer's explanation was delivered with the same emotional flatness that now afflicted Rick. Neural pathways are like riverbeds. When dammed, they begin to fill with silt. When reopened, the water never flows quite the same way again. Each time we block emotions, the capacity to feel them diminishes. Many in our society have undergone so many procedures they feel nothing at all. Rick discovered the terrible truth. His emotional detachment wasn't just a philosophical choice formed by cosmic awareness, but a physiological reality. Parts of his brain's emotional centers had been permanently altered, leaving him unable to connect deeply with others even when he intellectually wanted to. In The Old Man in the Seat, we see this damaged emotional capacity when Rick forms an antagonistic relationship with a stranger who used his private toilet. Even this small territorial violation becomes significant to Rick precisely because his emotional range is so limited. The few connections he can still form, even negative ones, become magnified in importance. Before leaving the dimension, Rick demanded one last service from the engineers: a brain scan showing exactly which emotional pathways had been permanently altered. The images revealed scattered dead zones throughout his limbic system, particularly in areas governing attachment, empathy, and emotional memory, explaining why he could remember loving his wife and daughter but couldn't fully reconnect with those feelings. "Your intelligence remains completely intact," Dr. Nervo assured him, as if this were consolation enough. Many consider it an improvement, the burden of feeling lifted while keeping all cognitive benefits. While Dr. Nervo's assurances echoed in Rick's mind, he was already calculating how to counter the effects of his emotional dampening, not realizing that his next discovery would make him question whether emotions were worth reclaiming at all. Following unusual energy spikes that matched his own portal gun's signature but with subtle, harmonic variations, Rick tracked 7 identical energy patterns converging at regular intervals in what appeared to be empty space. The readings didn't make sense. The coordinates led to a void between dimensions, a place that shouldn't exist at all. After recalibrating his portal gun to match these harmonic frequencies, Rick fired a test portal into what should have been nothingness. The swirling green vortex opened into a pocket dimension unlike anything Rick had encountered before. A perfect dodecahedron chamber floating in a starless void. Inside, 7 men in lab coats turned simultaneously as he stepped through, each with the same shock of wild hair, the same piercing eyes, and the same face. His face. "C-137, we presume," one of them said, stepping forward with a casual smile. "We've been expecting you to find us eventually. Welcome to the think tank." This early gathering of Ricks explained they'd been meeting for nearly 3 years, having discovered each other through similar methods of tracking interdimensional anomalies. Unlike the bureaucratic citadel that would eventually form, this group operated as genuine collaborators, sharing breakthroughs, warning each other of threats, and pooling their collective genius toward understanding the multiverse's deepest secrets. "We call ourselves the Council," said a Rick with a small scar above his right eye. "Though that's probably too formal for what we actually do here." Rick was skeptical at first, wary of their intentions, but their openness disarmed him. They showed him their projects freely: dimension mapping algorithms, unified field theories that actually worked, and mechanical designs that made Rick's own inventions look primitive. Each Rick had specialized in slightly different areas of research, creating a think tank of complementary expertise rather than redundant knowledge. Their greatest achievement was displayed proudly in the center of the chamber, a three-dimensional holographic map they called the Central Finite Curve. Still incomplete, it showed a subsection of the infinite multiverse where clear patterns emerged. "We're mapping only the dimensions where we exist," explained a Rick with a mechanical arm. "Where we're the smartest beings in our respective universes. The patterns are fascinating." Rick studied the map, immediately grasping its significance. No single Rick could have compiled this data alone. It represented millions of calculations and thousands of dimensional surveys. The implications were staggering. With this map, one could predict dimensional convergence points, locate specific realities with desired characteristics, even potentially create stable bridges between normally incompatible universes. For several weeks, Rick joined their regular meetings, contributing his own research while learning from theirs. He found himself enjoying the intellectual camaraderie of minds equal to his own, without the competitive edge that usually accompanied such gatherings. But gradually, Rick began noticing disturbing patterns in their work. Small comments, subtle references to adjustments they'd made to certain dimensions. One Rick casually mentioned correcting a timeline where scientific development had stalled. Another spoke of guiding a civilization toward a technological breakthrough by introducing specific equations into their scientific community. "We're not just observing the multiverse," Rick realized during one session. "We're manipulating it, playing gods." The Rick with the mechanical arm smiled. "Is that so different from what you do every time you step through a portal? We're simply being more deliberate." During a private conversation with the scar-faced Rick, who seemed the most reasonable of the group, Rick learned the true scope of their ambitions. The Central Finite Curve wasn't just a map, it was a blueprint for something far more profound. "Imagine 7 Ricks working together. Already we've accomplished more than any individual Rick could alone," Scar Rick explained, eyes alight with fervor. "Now imagine hundreds of Ricks united, thousands, all working in perfect harmony toward shared goals." "Sounds like my personal hell," Rick replied, trying to mask his growing unease. "That's because you're thinking like an individual. We've moved beyond that limitation." Scar Rick lowered his voice. "The ultimate goal isn't collaboration, it's unification. We're developing technology to merge our consciousness across dimensions, becoming a single Rick entity spanning the multiverse." The revelation hit Rick like a physical blow. These versions of himself weren't just cooperating, they were working toward the complete erasure of individual identity, creating what would essentially be a Rick god with absolute power over reality itself. When Rick questioned the ethics and risks of such a plan, he received only dismissive responses. "Individual identity is an evolutionary dead end," explained the Rick with a mechanical arm. "The next step is collective consciousness. One mind with the power and perspective to truly understand and guide the multiverse." What disturbed Rick most wasn't the plan itself, but how easily he could have embraced it under different circumstances. He recognized in each council Rick the same arrogance, the same certainty, the same fundamental belief in his own rightness that had driven many of Rick's own decisions. The council was a mirror reflecting the darkest potential of his own intellect unchecked by restraint. That night, while the other Ricks slept, they maintained a shared schedule for efficiency. Rick examined their central database. What he found confirmed his worst fears: detailed plans for expanding their consciousness-merging technology across the entire central finite curve, forcibly incorporating any Rick who refused to join willingly. The unification wouldn't be a choice, it would be an assimilation. "They're not trying to collaborate with other versions of themselves," Rick muttered as he downloaded evidence of their plans. "They're trying to consume them." The decision to act came without hesitation. Using his intimate knowledge of his own technology fundamentally similar to what the Council used, Rick sabotaged their dimensional stabilizers while planting charges at key structural points throughout the pocket dimension. When confronted by the awakened Council, Rick stood before the central finite curve map, detonator in hand. "Did you really think I'd just let you turn all versions of me, into some cosmic hive mind?" Rick asked, looking at each of his counterparts in turn. "Hard pass." "You don't understand what you're destroying," pleaded Scar Rick. "This is evolution, progress." "No, it's surrender," Rick replied. "Giving up what makes us individuals. I'd rather be the most miserable, broken-down Rick in the multiverse than be a functioning cog in your collective." As alarms blared and the pocket dimension began collapsing, Rick opened a portal back to his garage. 6 of the Council Ricks managed to escape through their own portals, but Scar Rick remained behind, watching as their years of work disintegrated. "This isn't over," Scar Rick called out as a reality fractured around them. "The idea can't be destroyed. We'll find each other again. We'll build something new. Something you can't stop." Rick paused at the portal's edge. "Maybe, but it won't be this, and I'll be ready." As he stepped through to safety, the pocket dimension imploded behind him, the central finite curve map shattering into a million fragments of light before winking out of existence. The portal gun flickered out as Rick stepped into the aftermath of destruction. For most people, escaping a collapsing pocket dimension would be cause for celebration, but the usual smirk of triumph was absent from his face. Instead, his expression was distant, haunted by something deeper than the Council's failed unification plan. As he pocketed his portal gun and reached for the flask at his hip, his fingers brushed against a small photograph he kept hidden behind it, worn at the edges, faded from being handled too many times. A woman's face smiled back at him, preserved in a moment from before everything went wrong. Rick had mastered interdimensional travel, destroyed a cabal of alternate selves, and unlocked secrets of the multiverse that would drive lesser minds insane. Yet there remained one journey he'd been avoiding for years: finding Diane. Not his Diane, of course. She was gone. But in a multiverse of infinite possibilities, there had to be dimensions where she still existed. The thought had lingered in the back of his mind through countless adventures, a question he couldn't silence. What if he could see her again? It started as a scientific expedition. At least that's what Rick told himself as he programmed a specialized algorithm into his portal gun. The device hummed as it processed variables, isolating dimensions where Diane's unique biosignature still registered. The first coordinates appeared, and Rick's hand trembled slightly as he fired a swirling green portal into the wall of his garage. The first Diane he found lived in a modest suburban home, much like the one he had abandoned decades ago. Through the window, Rick watched her gardening, laughing with neighbors, living a life completely devoid of interdimensional chaos. What struck him wasn't just that she was alive, but that she seemed genuinely happy. Happier than he remembered his Diane being during their final years together. When he finally approached her, introducing himself with a carefully rehearsed story, she smiled politely, shook his hand, and looked at him with the blank politeness reserved for strangers. This Diane had never met any version of Rick Sanchez. Her life had taken an entirely different path, one that led to contentment without the brilliant, troubled scientist who stood before her now. He left after 20 minutes of awkward small talk, the weight in his chest heavier than when he arrived. The second Diane recognized him immediately. "Rick?" she had whispered, her coffee cup slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor of the small cafe where he'd found her. For one electric moment, hope surged through him, until she explained that her Rick had died years ago in a laboratory accident. Their brief connection fractured the moment she realized he wasn't her. Rick returned from the dead, but a dimensional traveler, an imposter wearing her husband's face. "You look just like him," she said softly. But your eyes are different. You've seen things my Rick never did. That encounter ended with her asking him to leave, unable to bear the ghost of possibilities his presence represented. Rick's search grew more methodical, more desperate. He found a dimension where Diane had become a revolutionary leader, spearheading resistance against an authoritarian regime. Her face appeared on posters throughout the city. Her voice rallied thousands to action. When Rick finally managed to meet her, she sized him up with the shrewd assessment of someone accustomed to weighing potential allies and threats. "So you're the one who's been asking about me," she said, twirling, a knife between her fingers with practiced ease. This Diane had never married, had dedicated her life to fighting oppression. She found his interdimensional technology interesting only as a potential weapon for her cause. In another reality, Diane was a brilliant physicist whose theories on quantum entanglement rivaled Rick's own work. They spent 3 days collaborating in her laboratory, their minds syncing in ways that reminded him painfully of their early relationship. "We could revolutionize interdimensional travel together," she proposed, eyes bright with scientific ambition. But when Rick hinted at something more personal, she gently explained that her work was her life's passion. "I chose science over family long ago," she told him. "I can't imagine having made any other choice." The variations continued. A Diane who had become a renowned artist, another who lived as a nomad traveling the world, one who had founded a major corporation. Each version was recognizably her, yet fundamentally changed by the absence of Rick in her life. Some were happier, some more accomplished, some more damaged, but all were leading lives that had meaning without him. The most difficult encounter came in a dimension almost identical to his original timeline. There, Rick found not just Diane alive, but their family intact. This Rick had never created a portal gun, had channeled his genius into more modest inventions that improved life on Earth without opening doorways to other dimensions. He watched from a distance as this alternate family version shared dinner, the other Rick telling jokes that made Diane throw her head back in laughter, that same laugh that haunted his dreams. When the family dispersed, the alternate Rick approached him directly in the darkened yard. "I know you're there," he called out. "I may not have a portal gun, but I'm still Rick Sanchez. I can sense myself a mile away." The two Ricks sat on the porch steps, two versions of the same man separated by radically different choices. The domestic Rick looked older, with gray hair and smile lines around his eyes, but lacked the hardened edge that interdimensional travel had carved into our Rick. "You want to know if you made the wrong choice," the domestic Rick said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "I want to know if she's happy," our Rick replied, his voice unusually quiet. "Happier than she would have been with a man who abandoned her to chase scientific breakthroughs across dimensions," the other Rick said bluntly. "But that's not really what you're asking, is it? You want to know if you could have been happy staying?" Our Rick didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. The domestic Rick sighed, looking back toward the warmly lit house. "I won't lie to you. There are days I think about what might be out there, the discoveries I never made. But then Diane laughs, or Beth asks for help with her homework, and I remember why I chose this." He paused, studying his dimensional counterpart. "You're welcome to stay for dinner, but you can't take my place. You know that, right?" Rick never took him up on the dinner offer. He returned to his empty garage, the weight of these encounters crushing down on him. The problem wasn't just that Diane was gone from his original dimension. It was that seeing her alive and well across the multiverse only highlighted everything he had sacrificed. Each reunion proved more painful than the last, showing him what could never be his again. The multiverse, infinite in its possibilities, couldn't provide the one thing he truly wanted: to undo his own choices. While searching for Diane across dimensions proved futile, Rick stumbled upon something far more unexpected: a dimension where time flowed backwards. In this unusual reality, causality operated in reverse, with effects preceding causes and endings coming before beginnings. Rick initially entered this dimension purely out of scientific curiosity. He'd theorized about time-reversed physics for years, but never encountered a practical example. What he couldn't possibly have anticipated was meeting someone who would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his interdimensional journey. The portal had barely stabilized when Rick heard a voice behind him. "Grandpa Rick, you're early." Spinning around, he found himself face to face with a teenage boy in a yellow shirt, who seemed not just familiar with him, but downright excited to see him. The kid had a somewhat anxious demeanor, with a slight hunch and nervously fidgeting hands, but his eyes lit up with recognition. "Do I know you?" Rick questioned, portal gun still clutched defensively in his hand. He had no grandchildren. Beth was still young and hadn't even met Jerry yet in his timeline. "Oh geez, this must be your first time meeting me," the boy replied, suddenly understanding. "I'm Morty, your grandson." "Well, I will be your grandson. Or I am your grandson. Time gets pretty confusing around here." Rick's skepticism was immediate and intense. This had to be some kind of trap or con, perhaps the work of an enemy who'd tracked him through dimensions. "Nice try, whatever you are. I don't have grandkids, and I'm not exactly the family reunion type." To Rick's surprise, Morty seemed entirely unfazed by his hostility. The boy simply smiled sadly and said, "You haven't met me yet because in your normal timeline, I haven't been born. But here, where time runs backwards, we've already had hundreds of adventures together. For me, this is one of our last meetings. For you, it's our first." Still suspicious, Rick demanded proof. What followed was a demonstration that left even his genius mind reeling. This Morty proceeded to disassemble Rick's portal gun, modify it with components Rick hadn't even designed yet, and recalibrate it to account for quantum fluctuations Rick had only theorized about. But what truly convinced him was when Morty casually mentioned details about Rick's past that no one could possibly know. The name of his childhood dog, the first girl he'd kissed, even the specific component that had failed during his third portal test. "These aren't things I'd tell just anyone," Rick muttered, finally beginning to accept the bizarre reality of the situation. "No, they're not," Morty agreed. "But we've spent a lot of time together. Or we will. Man, reverse grammar is hard." As Rick spent more time in this backward dimension, he witnessed something truly unsettling, his relationship with Morty playing out in reverse. In this dimension, their most recent adventures came first. Rick observed moments where they fought side by side with a synchronicity that spoke of years of partnership. He saw a Morty who could anticipate his thoughts, finish his scientific explanations, and even call him out on his more self-destructive tendencies. "In this timeline, I'm watching us grow apart," Morty explained. "The longer we know each other, the less connected we become. But in your timeline, it'll be the opposite. We'll start as strangers and become whatever we are at the end." "And what exactly are we at the end?" Rick asked. Morty thought for a moment. "Something like family, but more complicated. Something like friends, but more dysfunctional." As days passed, or technically, days unpassed in this reverse dimension, Rick observed Morty gradually becoming more naive, more innocent, literally becoming younger in his worldview, if not his physical appearance. The cynical edge that seemed so familiar to Rick in their early encounters slowly gave way to a wide-eyed wonder about the universe. During one particularly quiet moment, as they sat watching a sunset that was technically a sunrise in reverse, Morty turned to Rick with surprising seriousness. "You know, in normal time, you're going to need me." "Need you? I don't need anyone, kid." "Yeah, that's what you always say at first. But there's more to it than just companionship." Morty reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, no larger than a thumb drive. "Your brain gives off a specific wavelength of brainwaves, genius waves. They're incredibly powerful, but they're also like a beacon. They draw attention from beings across the multiverse who can detect them." Rick took the device, turning it over in his hands. "And what does this have to do with you?" "My brainwaves are the exact opposite of yours," Morty explained. "They're what you might call complementary. When we're together, our brainwaves create a kind of camouflage. Your genius waves get canceled out by my, well, whatever you want to call my waves." "Morty waves," Rick suggested with a hint of amusement. "You'll need me for protection and companionship," Morty continued, gesturing to the device. "That contains recordings of my brainwave patterns. Study them. Eventually, you'll understand why they're important." The scientific implications were immediately obvious to Rick. A natural camouflage created by complementary brainwave patterns could explain how he might someday navigate dangerous situations without being detected by enemies who could track his unique mental signature. It was elegant in its simplicity, the perfect scientific solution. But there was something else in Morty's explanation that caught Rick's attention. "You said protection and companionship. That's two things." Morty smiled. "You'll need me for those, yeah. But most importantly, you'll need me to remember what it means to care about something." Before Rick could argue, Morty added, "Even if you don't want to admit it?" As their time in the reverse dimension came to an end, Rick found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about this strange future grandson that pulled at parts of him he thought long dead, especially after his fruitless search for Diane across the multiverse. "When exactly do we meet?" "In normal time, I mean," Rick asked as he prepared his portal gun for departure. "I can't tell you that. Temporal paradoxes and all that. You taught me about those." Morty smiled. "But you'll know when it's time. Just don't wait too long. The longer you stay away, the harder it gets for everyone." As the green portal swirled to life, Rick hesitated. "What if I don't want this future? What if I don't want to be someone's grandfather?" Morty's expression softened. "That's always been your choice, Rick, but I think you'll make the right one eventually." After stepping back through the portal to normal space-time, Rick sat alone in his workshop, the small brainwave device resting on his workbench. After a long moment of contemplation, he pulled out his journal and made a brief entry. "Locate Beth's family in approximately 10 years. Important scientific purpose. Brainwave compatibility with grandson." Rick's contemplation of family reconnection didn't last long. The universe had a much crueler lesson waiting. Just beyond the mathematical boundaries of normal physics lurked a dimension so fundamentally disturbing that most beings who glimpsed it were driven instantly mad. But for Rick, it offered something worse than madness: clarity. Looking at the brainwave recorder Morty had given him, Rick found himself drawn to a series of equations scribbled along its metallic edge. Equations that shouldn't make sense yet appeared repeatedly across multiple dimensions. These mathematical anomalies kept showing up like cosmic fingerprints, taunting Rick with their impossible solutions. After months of obsessive work, Rick modified his portal gun in a way that violated several fundamental laws of physics, creating a portal unlike any he'd made before. This one wasn't green or blue, but an unsettling void black that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. When Rick stepped through, he didn't arrive in another version of reality, but at what appeared to be reality's edge, the boundary where existence itself began to fray. The dimension, if it could even be called that, consisted of endlessly shifting geometric patterns that his mind couldn't properly process. These patterns weren't random. They were organized in ways that suggested intelligence, like the visible code of the universe itself. Rick later described it in his journal as watching reality's source code execute in real time. The entities inhabiting this space weren't alive in any conventional sense. They existed as self-aware mathematical patterns, configurations of energy that had somehow developed consciousness without bodies, brains, or any physical substrate. They recognized Rick's presence immediately, shifting their patterns to accommodate his perception, essentially dumbing down reality so his limited human mind could process even a fraction of what he was seeing. Communication with these entities wasn't verbal or even telepathic in the usual sense. Instead, understanding flooded directly into Rick's consciousness. The first revelation hit him like a physical blow. Reality, as experienced by conscious beings, is an emergent illusion, a side effect of the universe's fundamental processes rather than its purpose. The entities showed Rick that consciousness itself is just a pattern that temporarily forms in certain complex systems, like eddies in a stream that appear and disappear without affecting the water's overall flow. What truly shattered Rick was the mathematical proof they provided. Equations that demonstrated consciousness, free will, and meaning are all emergent properties with no cosmic significance. The universe doesn't care about conscious experience because it can't care. It simply exists as patterns unfolding according to intrinsic properties. The horror wasn't that the universe is cruel, but that it's perfectly indifferent. As Rick would later explain to Bird Person in a rare moment of vulnerability, it's not that nothing matters, it's that mattering itself is just another pattern in the noise. The entities themselves existed in perfect acceptance of this reality. They understood their own meaninglessness completely, yet continued to exist without distress. When Rick's mind began breaking under the weight of these revelations, they attempted to comfort him by showing that the horror he felt was itself just another pattern, neither more nor less significant than any other configuration in the universe. Rick spent what subjectively felt like years in this place, though his body showed no signs of aging. Time itself operated differently here, flowing according to mathematical principles rather than physical laws. The entities taught Rick to perceive reality in ways his brain wasn't designed to handle, expanding his consciousness while simultaneously stripping away the comforting illusions that make existence bearable for most beings. They showed him how the entire multiverse functions as a kind of naturally occurring simulation, not designed by any intelligence, but simply growing like an infinitely complex fractal pattern. Reality itself wasn't created for any purpose, but simply exists as one possible configuration among countless others. Free will, they demonstrated, is an illusion born from the limited perspective of consciousness. Every choice, merely the inevitable result of prior conditions and quantum probabilities. In the episode Rick Potion Number 9, we see hints of this knowledge when Rick casually abandons an entire reality after catastrophically altering it, showing how his experience in this dimension fundamentally changed his perspective on the value of individual lives and timelines. The mathematical certainty that infinite versions of himself and Morty exist across the multiverse made the loss of any single reality insignificant in his calculus. Most disturbing was what the entities showed Rick about consciousness itself, that it's not a fundamental property of the universe but a kind of accidental byproduct, a quirk of complexity that emerged without purpose. They demonstrated how conscious experience could be broken down into equations, reduced to patterns that follow the same basic principles as non-conscious systems. This revelation formed the foundation of Rick's nihilistic worldview, his certainty that searching for meaning is fundamentally misguided. When Rick finally managed to leave this dimension, he discovered that only hours had passed in normal space-time, though his mind had experienced what felt like years. The experience had permanently altered his perception of reality. He could now see the underlying patterns in everyday existence, the mathematical underpinnings of conscious experience itself. This awareness became both a burden and a source of his seemingly impossible scientific achievements. He could now perceive aspects of reality hidden from normal consciousness. The experience gave Rick a unique perspective on simulation theory. Unlike those who fear reality might be an artificial construct created by advanced beings, Rick had seen something far more disturbing. That reality simply emerged without purpose or design, a natural process as indifferent to conscious experience as weather patterns are to umbrellas. This knowledge informed his casual creation of mini-universes as power sources, seeing no moral difference between natural and created realities since both are equally meaningless in the grand scheme. Upon returning to his workshop, Rick's first project was the microverse battery, a deliberate recreation of the meaningless cosmos he had witnessed. By creating a miniature universe whose inhabitants unknowingly power his car, Rick wasn't just being pragmatic. He was enacting a kind of cosmic joke, recreating the same meaningless pattern that had been revealed to him. The inhabitants of his battery, like all conscious beings including Rick himself, believe their existence has purpose and meaning, unaware they're just temporary patterns in a larger system that doesn't care about their experiences. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on Rick. After countless years building microverses and manipulating realities like a disinterested god, he stumbled across something that shattered his carefully constructed nihilism. It was a dimension nearly identical to his original timeline, except for one crucial difference. In this reality, Rick Sanchez never abandoned his family. This discovery wasn't planned. Rick had been tracking unusual energy signatures that matched his own portal technology when he detected something unexpected. A faint, familiar signature that shouldn't exist in a dimension where he supposedly never developed interdimensional travel. When Rick arrived, he found himself looking at an elderly version of himself. A Rick who had aged naturally without the life-extending technologies our Rick had developed during his interdimensional adventures. This alternate Rick moved slowly, his body bearing the natural consequences of time. But there was something in his eyes that our Rick hadn't seen in his own reflection for decades: contentment. While our Rick remained relatively youthful in appearance, preserved by his scientific interventions, this Rick's face was mapped with lines that told stories of laughter and connection rather than isolation. Our Rick observed this family from a distance, using cloaking technology to remain undetected. What he witnessed was a stark contrast to the family dynamics he knew. This alternate Beth had grown up with a continuous paternal presence, and the difference was striking. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that wasn't defensive or brittle. Her accomplishments weren't attempts to fill a void or prove her worth. They were genuine expressions of who she was. Most jarring for Rick to witness was her relationship with her husband. There was none of the passive-aggressive tension he'd observed in other dimensions, just a partnership built on mutual respect. During his observation, Rick discovered that this alternate version of himself was terminally ill. Despite having considerable scientific knowledge, this Rick had chosen not to extend his life artificially, instead accepting mortality as the natural conclusion to a life well lived. Our Rick couldn't comprehend this choice. Why would any version of himself accept death when there were countless ways to cheat it? The answer became clearer as he continued watching the family interact around the dying Rick. This Rick had something worth leaving behind, a legacy that wasn't measured in scientific breakthroughs, but in the lives he'd influenced. When the alternate Rick finally passed away, it happened peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. Our Rick couldn't resist attending the funeral, still cloaked from detection. He positioned himself at the back of the gathering, watching Beth deliver a eulogy that described a father who had always been there, for science fairs and heartbreaks, for graduations and wedding days. Her grief wasn't complicated by abandonment or betrayal. It was the clean grief of having loved and been loved completely. As tears streamed down her face, Rick noticed something profound. She wasn't angry. There was no bitterness or resentment tainting her sadness, just the natural sorrow of saying goodbye to someone who had been a consistent, loving presence in her life. After the service concluded and mourners began to disperse, Rick found himself following this dimension's adult Morty. Unlike the nervous, traumatized Morty he occasionally dragged through dangerous adventures, this Morty moved with purpose and confidence. Rick tracked him to a laboratory that looked nothing like his own chaos-filled garage. This space was orderly and bright, with plants growing along the windows and clearly labeled equipment. He watched as Morty worked on what appeared to be a medical device, muttering calculations to himself in a way that reminded Rick painfully of his own work habits. Suddenly, Morty stopped working and looked directly toward where Rick was standing, despite the cloaking technology that should have made him completely invisible. "I know you're there," Morty said calmly. "Grandpa Rick said you might come." The young man didn't seem surprised or alarmed, merely expectant, as if this encounter had been anticipated for years. Rick hesitated before disabling his cloaking device, revealing himself to the alternate Morty. "How did you know I was here?" he demanded, uncomfortable with being detected. Morty smiled sadly. "Grandpa always said that if he was right about the multiverse, another version of himself would eventually find us. He said you'd be watching at the funeral. Too proud to show yourself, but too curious to stay away." He gestured around the lab. "This is what I do now. I took what Grandpa taught me about science and I use it to help people. These devices go to hospitals throughout our solar colony network." Rick examined one of the inventions, immediately recognizing it as a neural regenerator, technology he had developed years ago, but had never bothered to share. "You could make weapons with this same principle," he commented. "More profitable." "I could," Morty agreed, "but that's not the legacy Grandpa wanted to leave. He said science should serve humanity, not the other way around." He walked to a small safe embedded in the wall and entered a complex series of numbers. "Before he died, Grandpa gave me something to pass along if another Rick ever showed up." From the safe, Morty retrieved a small wooden box that looked handcrafted. He said only a Rick from another dimension would fully understand what's inside. He handed the box to Rick, who took it reluctantly, as if it might contain something dangerous. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed the alternate Rick surrounded by his family, Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty, all looking genuinely happy. Rick stared at the image, taking in the contentment on everyone's faces, including his alternate self. The note was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "It's not too late for you, but it will be soon." He wanted me to tell you something else, Morty added quietly. He said that he never regretted staying. Not once. The young man studied Rick's face carefully. He also said that your Beth is still waiting for you to come home, even if she doesn't know it herself. Rick remained silent, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. In all his interdimensional travels, all his experiments and adventures, he had never encountered something that challenged his worldview quite like this. Proof that a version of himself had chosen family over science and had not regretted it. If you look at the core of Rick's journey through the multiverse, we can see that what the creators emphasized rings true. His genius is both his gift and his curse. The struggle between Rick's incredible intelligence and his capacity for emotional connection defines who he is. His cynicism isn't something the multiverse forced upon him. It's the shield he constructed to protect himself from vulnerability and loss. The emotional walls Rick built weren't inevitable. In each dimension he visited, he made choices about what to take away from those experiences. Sometimes those choices left permanent marks on him, whether physical or psychological, gradually assembling the complicated, contradictory person who eventually found his way to the Smith family garage. As we drift towards sleep, there's something comforting in knowing that the multiverse contains infinite possibilities. Somewhere out there exists a Rick who allowed himself to remain vulnerable, who embraced connection rather than running from it. Maybe that's why our Rick keeps going on adventures with Morty. Deep down, he's searching for the path not taken.